Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's stream. My name is Ariana. I am the co-director of the Consent Academy, a Seattle-based nonprofit that's focused on promoting consent culture as part of everyday life. And today I'm joined by somebody that I constantly fangirl about, who also I feel proud to call my friend. Cheryl, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, thank you. The kind words, Aria. I'm so glad we got to work together back in the day when we were doing streaming shows. But for everybody who hasn't met me, hi, my name is Cheryl Platz. I am a nerd of many hats. I am an author, a video game developer, a user experience designer, an actor. Although I'm currently on a break because I moved to Los Angeles. And that's what you do, right? You move to Los Angeles and act less. I think that's how that goes. I wrote a book called Design Beyond Devices about creating more inclusive, more less sort of obsessed with a single point in time experiences. And I worked at a lot of different types of companies, big ones like Microsoft and Amazon. Worked on a lot of different types of experiences. Like I worked on Alexa and Cortana, and I was design lead for Microsoft Azure, which is definitely a very nerdy thing to have worked on. And currently, I worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for 3 years during the pandemic. That was a ride. And I am currently the director of user experience for the player platform at Riot Games, the home of League of Legends and that series on Netflix, Arcane, if you saw that. So it's been, and you may have noticed, I am a fan of Pokemon.
Yes, I think that was one of the first things you told me about yourself was how much you love Pikachu. Maybe we even just bonded about that immediately. I'm a big fan of Pokemon as well. Deep love in my heart that will never go away for how cool Pokemon is. But I do just want to say I love hearing the sort of journey of your career because I think that you've worn so many hats, but from everything you've told me about the kinds of work you do, you always, do your best for whatever role you're in to bring as much sort of excellence to it. I promise this whole stream will not be me just complimenting you. But yeah, you bring a lot of excellence to things. And one of the things I've also always noticed about you is a curiosity, a willingness to sort of say, I think that this situation could be better. We could make room for more people. We could actually cater to more types of people or anything along those lines. And even when you didn't have, say, all the knowledge about this is how you then make this user interface more accessible to this kind of person, it has always sounded to me like you were really willing to then say, it's okay that I don't know. I'm going to go learn what I can. I'm going to talk to other people who know. I'm going to get resources, not just say, oh, what can I do? And as somebody who's a leadership geek, at Consent Academy, we have a whole series that's just consent and leadership. And we teach people how to bring leadership to any kind of role, formal or informal, whether you're just a random volunteer in some subcultural group or a CEO, it kind of applies across the board. And that's one of the biggest things is the open-mindedness, the sort of systems thinking, the willingness to be curious and to self-reflect. And that's one of the reasons why I really think that you're inspirational, because that's not common to find in a lot of people, especially people in uh, prominent tech positions, in my experience. So, just as a small question, or I guess it's not a small question, sort of what motivates you in these roles to kind of want to bring this sort of new challenges to things and create more inclusive spaces?
Well, I think one of the things that drew me to user experience design in general, and so for folks who may not be familiar with the field, the way I describe the field folks who are completely uninitiated is I'm the one whose job it is to make sure you don't want to throw your computer or phone or video game console across the room. With the exception that video game console, if you hate the way the gameplay feels, that's not me. But if you hate the UI because it got in the way of your gameplay, that would be something that a user experience designer might work on. And my background at Carnegie Mellon was a degree in computer science, and then I added a double major in human-computer interaction. And I found myself so frustrated when I would be working on computer science problems that had no human connection. One of the first, the second class, big computer science class my freshman year, great theoretical ideas in computer science, where they discuss famous problems like NP-complete if you're a super computer science nerd. They do things like, okay, well, this week we're going to learn how to enumerate all the possible poker hands. And it's like, but why? Why are we spending all this? Like, there's so many smart people in this room. What could we do? Like, could we run hypotheticals about how this stuff, but I don't really care about map coloring. I care about like human impact. And it's a little reductive. Like maps are important, sure, but that was learning a lot about myself. And one of the reasons I went to that school too was when I was looking at colleges, I wanted to do tech, but I was also interested in creativity. And then I heard about this program that combined computer science, visual design, and cognitive psychology. And then I was just sold because like the human element was so important to me. And that has kind of carried through the whole time. This is going really a deep cut too, but my very first job was as a Muppet. I was a teenage Muppet. I worked at a theme park for 3 years as a Sesame Street Muppet performer, character in a full body costume sometimes, or as a parade performer. And like, I learned a lot about people that way that I would not have otherwise. You're an observer when you're in the costume hugging people and like observing families. You learn so much about like the wide variety of humanity, and like kids whisper in Grover's ear like, Grover, it's so good to see you. Mom and Dad are fighting again. And like, oh Jesus, I don't know how to. And so like it gives you a much, you're in your teenage formative years, and it gives you it's a blessing to have a much better empathy for a wide variety of people. Which is not to say that I'm perfect, and not to say that I don't have weak spots or things that I miss, but I think like I credit that job and then finding that program that included computer science and my insatiable appetite for reading. I threw a whole fit when they told me not to read at night because I was ruining my eyes and taped all my books shut. Those things, they just all combined, and here I am as an adult, curious about everything and thinking about people as individuals and trying to figure out, I don't want that kid whose parents are having a hard time being excluded. And of course, for most of my life, I didn't have any I was a white woman in tech, right? So that's one marginalization, but it's not many. I later found out I've been living with a disability my whole life. That's a whole other topic. But so you get a little bit of the perspective, but you don't have the whole thing. But it does give you a sense of what it's like sometimes to like, if that's how I feel, I don't want anybody to feel that. And I certainly don't want them to feel that, but magnified.
Yeah, I definitely love, okay, Krellin just let me know that you're sounding really echoey.
Oh, it's from me. Don't know if, oh, it's switched. Did it switch? No, it's on the right microphone. Weird.
Maybe I just turned down the thing a little bit, and maybe that'll help, but if it does sound a little echoey, it's tough, like a microphone in a large room, like, because I'm in a huge, like, 25 meter squared room with like 15.
I think they're talking about mine, but
yeah.
Not new. Well, hopefully things will resolve themselves.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure what's happening. I think maybe it could be coming through.
Oh yes, I am not wearing headphones. That's the thing. You can probably fix that.
Yeah, it's true, Carlin. Stream audio is always a moving goal. Anyway, it's I appreciate your talk about your sort of first job and the empathy it gave you, because I had a similar experience. My first job was working at GameStop. Um, like my first real job that was like sort of long term. And I learned really quickly that a lot of people in general come into things like stores because they're lonely. And I just saw the kind of extreme loneliness that a lot of people who were really into video games had. And I didn't think games were causing it or anything, but I thought, okay, clearly a lot of people are very attracted to games as a way to help them cope with the loneliness that they feel. And it was also a great lesson in consent and boundaries because, as you can imagine, I was like a, nerdy teenage girl um, who like to dress like an anime character and has large breasts and is willing to talk to anybody. And I attracted a lot of really, really lonely dudes who were not so great with understanding like social norms or boundaries. And I had like a boss who's like 20 years older than me, and he really did a good job of like helping me realize that, hey, these things might not be as like sweet and innocent as they think they are when people are just like so interested to hear my opinions on things. But then, and there were issues with like people I had like never talked to, like waiting outside the store for me to get off of work, or like waiting by my car in the parking lot kind of thing. And yes, that was like creepy and scary and weird, but it was also a really good lesson in just the like what can happen if loneliness goes for so long and people don't get good social skills practice, but then also just sort of like how a lot of non-consensual behavior is just sort of built into a lot of the ways people think about themselves and the world in either direction, whether it's their consent not being protected or them not, you know, um, affirming someone else's consent. And just sort of seeing this interplay. And it didn't make me like mad at people. I always just kind of felt bad and like sad and like wished there was something I could do and had to learn how to set boundaries. It was good practice for that. And that's also really carried with me through my whole life is just this understanding of really wanting to empathize with the people, even when I had to tell them, get away from me. Being able to do both at the same time was like a really good skill in life. And it motivates the work that I do today as well. So then, yeah, I liked you saying you were a teenage Muppet. Um, so then, when you have this book you wrote, The Design Beyond Devices, and it's really, I think, something that anybody who does any kind of design, even if it's not user interface design, should read to sort of think, not get so stuck into the role that they're in and think about like what it's actually going to be like to interact with this, whether it's just like other developers reading your code later or just really anything. How have people received this kind of push in your work? Are people generally pretty supportive of the changes you like to advocate for?
That's interesting. I think, there's designers and then there's the business. I think designers, for the most part, well, and within designers too, there's a large chunk of design right now that's hungry to question our impact, that see the negative impacts of like an Uber, for example, where something seemed like, yeah, we were fed this, oh, it's going to improve society, it's going to, extend public transit. And what it actually did was ruin a lot of taxi drivers' lives and exploit people and pay them too little. And designers realized that they had a part of that, a very powerful part of that, trying to figure out, well, how do I prevent myself from being a part of that system in the future or use my power for good? There are some designers who don't want any part of that. So there's a little sliver of them. And, and there's designers who realize that their livelihood is dependent on not applying that thinking, especially like when we start getting to Web3 and NFTs and that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of folks are like, hey, I really want better tools. So that group is very accepting of the core concept. Other group is really, really accepting is the folks who are dealing with inherently new technologies, AR, VR, voice. What's funny is, I think almost every tech company has a cross device experience that I thought, like what I talk about, because we have desktop and mobile, and a lot of times you're moving customers between the two. But many companies don't want to accept that they're in that world and should be thinking about the transitions. That's the whole thing. But when we talk about those designers, they're part of a bigger business. And it's the business that doesn't really want designers to be slowing things down.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's interesting. One of the big five consulting companies asked me to teach some of these concepts to their designers. And I was like, great, yeah, let's get more ethical. Let's do this. Let's get you some tools. But, the designers were asking, well, how do I apply some of this stuff when, our timelines are fixed? How do I can't just come in up front and like run a bunch of workshops, or how do I, when conditions are not ideal, how do I get a client who has an idea, like a picture of what they need in their head to broaden things a little bit? And so there's a group of designers who don't have as much agency, or companies who are in more rigid business models, like consulting, where they might, it's taking a little bit more creativity to realize that the concepts in the book, and that's why I frame a lot of my frameworks with like questions and things like that, like categories of questions. Like you can work questions into any part of your process without having to stop everything and get everybody in a room. Like I also give you tools if you would like to stop everybody and get everybody in a room. But part of, like, there's a whole spectrum of potential influence. In a perfect world, absolutely, like let's get everybody in a room and let's be as thoughtful as possible. But asking some of the right questions is better than asking none of the right questions. So even if you as a designer kind of work some of these muscles and get to the point where you know to ask a couple of these things midway or early on, you don't have to tell your the company up front, like, by the way, I am about to ask a question which I learned and is intended to make us more ethical. You don't have to do that. Just ask the question. And you will be stealth moving folks towards a more responsible model of development. And so that's, I think there's a lot of folks in design who are totally on board with this line of thought, but then it's like connecting the dots for their employers, either to getting them to see that they're already having cross-device experiences and they need the thought to transition between devices, or it's that like, this is all fine and great, but we don't work in a perfect world. How do we apply that?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really interesting, just even backing up to things like, quote unquote disruptive tech, or like, whatever. One of the issues that I think ends up coming up is that people will bring assumptions they don't even know that they have into the design choices that they make and the business choices that they make, and end up, and it doesn't matter if it's intentional or not, but basically end up entirely excluding certain types of people, entirely sort of like not considering all these other aspects of people's needs. And I think that, one of the things I always try to talk about when it comes to, say, like business or science communication is, if you want to change someone's mind, you can't come in with the like, here's why you should do this, blah, blah, blah. You need to figure out what is their value system and speak to that. So if I'm trying to get, say, business people to be more ethical, I'm going to appeal to, in the long run, this will make you more money. Because if you design your system or your product or whatever it is you're making, it doesn't even have to be like tech device things. It can also just be like, a textbook or a learning platform, or it can be, a festival, whatever. The more space you intentionally make for people who would have access barriers, the more money you will probably make in the long run. And the more people will be interested in supporting you, your company, your vision, your organization, whatever it is. And that also tends to make it more consensual overall as well, because it means that more people have the ability to say yes and say no at different points of time in interacting with any system. Um, so I think it's really, yeah, getting people out of this thinking of you don't even realize you have these assumptions and teasing them out and then looking at what do those assumptions then do is, I think, really, really important.
Completely agree. And that's like some of what I talk about in worlds where you have more time is like everybody trying to share what they believe they know and
Mm-hmm.
get it out on the table. Because and half the time when I see project teams spin out, it's because someone's holding like people are all have a different mental model that they didn't share, and they're basically talking about different things, those assumptions that they're making. But I think too, if you talk about new technology specifically, the model you just described, saying yes or no at different points of the process, becomes really interesting when we talk about multimodal experiences and excluding folks. Because I worked on early natural language technology, at least when it came mainstream. I worked on Cortana, and then I moved over to the Alexa team right after it became when it moved out of beta, and worked on like notification systems and some other stuff for them. And at the time, the natural language like assistant industry, everybody's like, yeah, voice first or voice only, that's the way of the future. I'm like, it's really great technology, but if we move the pendulum all the way over, then we're just excluding a different group of people. Like we've been excluding folks with visual impairments for a long time. Then we would just be excluding the people with audio impairments. So like
Yeah.
the real goal is somewhere in the middle. But when we talk about like, and if you find a place in the middle where you could seamlessly move between using physical and visual input versus invisible audio input or something, that provides people a ton of ability to opt into engaging with what is a little bit more sensitive of an input mechanism when we talk about voice. Because as we all know, voice recognition requires a microphone and your home or your space. And some people don't want the microphone at all. Some people want the microphone, but they want to turn it off at times. And some people are not going to be comfortable doing some sorts of things over the microphone. And so if you only have a voice only experience, then you're going to be excluding not just people with audio impairments, but like a bunch of other people who are not in that I'm totally comfortable with having a microphone in my home functional all the time.
Yeah.
But if you find something in the middle, suddenly people can make those consensual decisions on a more granular basis.
Yeah, yeah. I think that you bring up so many really interesting points, and I also think that it just as a baseline, if I'm if people are thinking of say like trying to make something more accessible to people who are blind, one of the things that I've been frustrated by when people be like, okay, yeah, we want to make this space or this platform or whatever more accessible, sometimes you can tell that they didn't actually talk to any blind people.
Yeah.
And like one of the biggest things that is often immediately obvious is that most people don't realize that it's only a very small percentage of people who are blind who have literally no vision, like no sensory data is processed by their brain that comes through the optic nerve. Most people who are blind do have some amount of information that can come in. It's similar with say people who use wheelchairs. I've seen so many posts on the internet, people being like, this person's clearly faking it because they can stand up. And it's like, well, actually, the vast majority of wheelchair users are not, people who are quote unquote paralyzed from X point down kind of situation. This is an assistance device for them.
Yeah,
And
so mad.
it makes me so mad too. And it's just, these are really, they seem like such simple assumptions, but like if you get them at scale across an industry, it creates a whole big sort of like just structure where this is built into it. And it really creates a lot of barriers. It reinforces problems. It also makes problems harder to change later. And yeah, it makes me so mad.
I just saw a tweet I think it was a tweet the other day from someone who I think it's Salesforce was talking about how they were talking to a blind customer who mentioned they could tell when an interface was designed by someone who had not spoken to folks with a vision impairment because their sort of screen reader UI was way too verbose. Like it was just super reading everything all the time. And they're like, I don't need that. Like they want something that describes the structure so they can decide what to drill in on and get more detail. But the design principle is actually the same as when you design for Alexa, which is that every syllable is time. And time is our most valuable resource as humans. So you should be optimizing for the minimum amount of time you take from someone to get them to their next step. But
Yeah.
if you're not engaging with folks with the vision impairment, then you're not going to learn that, which will come out very quickly, just like very, very quickly. There's like 1 or 2 tests with that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that Aradin wrote in the chat something that I think is really useful is that everyone should learn that everybody has biases, themselves and everybody else. Like, even if you're talking to somebody who is, say, from, a target test group, no matter what your sample size is, even if you got all of every single person from the possible demographic, there's always going to be biases in there. And learning to recognize and work with that rather than pretend it's not happening. And in our workshops, a lot of the time, people will come in and be like, okay, we've been told we have X kind of problem in our company or our organization or whatever. Just give us the answer of how we fix it. And there's never just like here's one thing you do and then you're good. But if we had something to say, it would be slow down a little bit, get more people involved and interacting with whatever thing it is you're creating, and get feedback from them. And that tends to produce slower, but often better and more sustainable outcomes. Because then, and it's like if you're running, say, an organization that has a community that it serves in some way or another, getting input from the people who actually interact with the things you're creating and giving people the opportunity to, give meaningful feedback that can lead to change. I see a lot of people who do any kind of organizing get really frustrated because they're like, oh, there's always complaints, there's always complaints, there's always complaints. And like, they don't know how hard it is on the back end. And I usually have an answer to that, which is like, let the person who has constructive criticism, give them some power to help make a change. Like, either they will just say, never mind, and then you don't have to worry about it as much because they're satisfied, or you will get something tremendously good from them and something that will help. And I think that that's also one of the things that I think is a lost opportunity in a lot of like feedback forms. And like, I've written in so many, and like, I don't think anyone's ever listened. I think, yeah, just it feels like
I can speak to that a little bit. For the
yes,
other
please.
Side. And it's funny because you've got designers on the other side who are like, I would like the feedback, please. And especially at the big companies, there's like feedback forms, and then there's this giant pulsating ball of data. And then there's like people on the other side who can't get the stuff out of the pulsating ball of data. Like we were okay at it on Azure. Like we could get to quantitative results and verbatims, like quotes from folks and things like that. But I've definitely been on projects where you couldn't, you knew they were out there, and you couldn't close the loop with folks. And I agree completely that, feedback, generally, there are some exceptions. Usually we're motivated by some kind of bigotry or but feedback in general can be a gift and an important signal. And those people are usually your most invested partners. And if you can channel that energy long term, that could be super great. Because it is really hard to recruit for a lot of these marginalized groups. And that could be an obstacle in and of itself. We run around, we're like, you should test with all these people. You should make sure that you have folks with vision impairment and audio impairments. And they're like, where do I find them? But the folks who are giving you complaints about the accessibility of these things are probably a start. It's tough because design research is inherently extractive, and really good reading is Design Justice for anyone who's interested in topics like this. But so like finding that balance where you're providing value to the person who's working with you and making sure they don't feel like it's just you that's getting value out of it, and you're meeting them where they are. Like, it's all very complicated, but someone coming to you with feedback uh, is like this, can be the start of a relationship.
Yeah. I think absolutely. And I love your point about a lot of it being extractive because I think this is something that's often really overlooked. And one of the easiest ways to help with that is to pay the person for their time. I've had friends who've gone to create like things like, they want to make an alternative to Zoom and they're like putting all these words in like decolonial and stuff. And I'm like, cool, I'm not sure how this is applicable to the thing you're making. It's a buzzword right now that makes me as an indigenous person kind of cringe most of the time where I'm like, okay. But they wanted to get people who are blind to interact with their thing. And I was like, cool, what's your budget? Like, how much are you willing to pay? And they were just like, what do you mean? Like, can you just ask your friends? And I was like, I mean, are you going to pay them? Like, they could do it out of the goodness of their heart, sure, but like, and I've just seen that so many times. And then I think one of the other things is like actually give the person credit. Like, I love when video games and stuff include the names of their playtesters in the credits because I'm like, that's important. Acknowledging that this person uh, was involved in creating this. We tend to want to kind of do this like power and credit hoarding, which is to say, like, because I'm the person who was like at the helm and had the master vision, it's me, but it's like, well, no, probably not. And like,
I mean, yeah, there's more than one person making a game. Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to credit like everybody who's ever gotten you to the point. I don't have to say like, hey, my first grade teacher, thanks for like being nice to me and all of that. Like, you can, but and if people were, go ahead, yeah.
I was gonna say, and like obviously, like there can be a line that people can draw. Like, okay, maybe people who have given you an hour of their time to play test and it's very transaction, maybe don't do that. But like if there's a longitudinal thing and somebody's giving you significant amount of time and then they're giving you like expert advice on a topic like something somebody would not have in essentially people who are testing with us and are vision impaired or audio acoustically impaired, they're testing, but they're kind of also consulting with us as experts.
Yes.
Right? Like we're recruiting them for a reason, and it's the expertise that they've gained through their lived experience.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think on the flip side, though, I've definitely consulted on things where people wanted to put my name on it to give me credit. And I was like, under no circumstances do I want to be associated with this.
Consent does matter.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there have been times where people are like, wow, you like really helped me out. And they like put my name on there. I'm like, please take my name off. I do not want anyone to know that I had anything to do with this hot mess. And like, I do not stand by the results that are being put out there.
Both things can be true.
Yes.
The project can be helped and maybe not reach the standard you were hoping for.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all the time. And it's tough because it's like, I think people get a little bit uncomfortable with some of these conversations because they feel like, all right, well, if I'm just paying everybody for any time they give me advice, isn't that making things like friendship or like peer groups or whatever so transactional? And I'm like, no, my opinion is not inherently, especially if there is a greater relationship there, or like there is, whether it's between you and this other person or it's between the product and the community, it's not necessarily inherently transactional. And when like something being transactional is not inherently bad, it's, to me, it's always more about like, does everyone really know what it is they're consenting to? Like, what's going to be expected of them? What are you going to do with my feedback? What are you going to do? Like, are you actually going to listen to me? Like, I will give you an hour of free consulting if you're actually going to take my advice. And that kind of thing. And I think it's Yeah, it's important. I have a different question for you, kind of a different
Okay.
topic, but it's also something that, because of things you've written on social media, it's been really good for me as someone who also has multiple disabilities. I also have Ehlers-Danlos, and I didn't, it took me forever to realize that like just chronic pain wasn't normal.
Yeah,
Just like,
yeah. The normal amount of pain is nothing.
yeah, I was
I
like, oh. And also just realizing that like I can ask for things from employers. Like I don't have to just be like, okay, but like sitting at a desk in this position all the time gives me terrible tendonitis, and then I can't like bend my elbow for like a month without terrible pain. Could we do something else? Like I just, this is a part of just the like daily non-consensual structures of the world. But I just really remember appreciating your discussions of like working for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Microsoft, and like both of them being companies that had such sort of like progressive statements of values, and then just like the complete inaccessibility of like the doorways in your office. And if it's okay, would you talk more about like how these things went and what you think companies could do better to make workplaces more accessible?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's there's physical accessibility, and then there's also like the structural accessibility of accommodations.
Yes.
And and so if you, I'm sure since you have Ehlers-Danlos, most people have heard about it on this channel before, but it's a connective tissue disease, and it kind of makes you more prone to joint injuries and systemic problems. And I lived with it for decades before getting diagnosed during the pandemic. But it means I had several injuries over the course of my time at Microsoft. I shattered a kneecap, and so I had several knee surgeries. And yeah, that was when I first had to like, well, I have to go into work, but I can't even, I can't open this door. Like the front door is accessible, but this other one isn't. And you're like balancing, and I can't put weight on the thing, and you just, and I had to carry a laptop between rooms, and it just, it was a hot mess. And
Mm-hmm.
it's, there's what's required on paper, and then there's considering the end-to-end experience of a human being.
Yeah.
And that's what, in my book, I talk about the concept of awful pessimism, what's the worst thing that can happen if you're successful, or, if you're successful at making the front door accessible, then lots more people with physical disabilities are going to get in the door. And then the worst thing that happens is they can't do anything else.
Hmm.
So what are we going to do about that? And I've seen change over time in some places. Like I think it was Microsoft. They were actually retrofitting some of the kitchens to be more accessible, changing the height of things like sinks and cabinets and stuff like that. I think the doors are still the doors, but but I also had a very bad experience in my last team at Microsoft when I sustained a work injury, because of the same situations like the same sort of situations you were describing. I didn't know I had EDS, but I was moved to a team that didn't have dedicated workspaces, didn't have dedicated desks. So, and I was crunching. So I was working like 8 to 10 hours a day, very intensive mouse and keyboard. And I woke up one day and I had like raptor claws for hands. Like I couldn't do anything with them.
Yeah.
And I'm like walking around the hallways, rubbing ice cold cans on my arms to try to break up the muscle tissue long enough to like reply to an email.
Yeah.
And that ended up being like a year-long, injury claim.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I asked for things like, I need a dedicated desk in the space. And then I asked for a coach, like, I need to shift my job duties while recovering. And they were like, it's not what we hired you for. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and, compounded with the fact that that was also a very toxic team where I witnessed racism and was the subject of gender discrimination, that I left the team, and I chose not to pursue legal action because, there's always that balancing. I would like to continue to work in the industry versus
Yeah.
versus what you're going to get out of the thing. But that's that systemic. They're required by law to provide the accommodations, but that doesn't mean they're going to do it.
Yeah.
When it comes down to it. And I think there's a lot of folks who just trust that the system is going to be there for them when they need it. But the fact is, and I tell my husband this all the time, like systems fail.
Yeah.
And I can almost, as a designer, you can almost predict exactly where they're going to fail because you can see where the little intersection points happen.
Yeah.
The foundation also, it was interesting at the foundation was we didn't even have a disabilities employee resource group. And I knew there were employees with physical disabilities. And so there was like a disability advocacy group that started to form, but it was mostly people who had children who were disabled, who didn't work at the company. And so like the discussions always went to like how the company could advocate for people with disabilities outside, not like, hey, what are we doing about the doors? Or, what are we doing about like the fact that the IT department doesn't have assigned desks, and so people like I did get my assigned desk eventually, but little points of friction that hit you as a disabled person. Like I go and I interview, I see everyone has assigned desks, and that's great because I'm like, great, I can ask for a split keyboard and vertical mouse, I'll be fine. And then I find out that just the IT department has hotel desks.
Oh,
so there's no way for me to like set up an ergo situation. And so then I have to do the whole request and exception, all the things. It's those little friction points all the time when you're living as a disabled person. And there was they hadn't really thought about like, well, what happens if hotel desks don't work for someone because they hadn't had to deal with it. But part of that's because there was no employee resource group kind of encouraging that inclusion first thought.
yeah. Oh, looks like it froze just a second.
I didn't know you.
You cut out just at the end, just there. But
even at an organization that touted those values.
Yeah, it's tough. It's so tough. Like
I'm gonna interrupt you. I'm seeing that we may be offline.
okay. Are we back? Let me see. Refresh fixed it. Seems like backup. All right, perfect. Thank you for pausing me, Cheryl.
Yay. That's why I have the computer on fire mode now.
Yeah. I should get one of those emotes. I'm actually running all of this off of a laptop that I bought in 2016 that was refurbished at the time.
I hear you. I was years on a 2013 laptop, and my community was so mad at me. They're like, "Why not you laptop?" I'm like, "Cause environment or something."
Yeah. Same. I mean, like just to complain about devices for a second, I've got an iPhone 7 that my mom, very lovely of her, bought for me September of 2019 because I had like the cheapest Moto E forever because I drop my phone all the time. I don't really like to get expensive phones, and I left that one on a bus and never saw it again. ADHD, but my mom got this for me. I've barely had it. And then back in January, the update fried the sound card. And apparently it's a known issue and Apple won't cover it. The only thing I could do is give them my phone and pay full price for a new one. And I was just like, okay, but it's a known issue and you didn't warn me before the update that it had a possibility to fry my sound card, and there's nothing that can be done. I've tried rolling it back. I've taken it to like every type of repair shop, like official ones versus also the ones that are just like random. And they've all been like, yeah, it's a known iPhone 7 issue. And I was just like,
Speaking of consent, you
yeah,
should have an opportunity to consent before your phone is destroyed. And this is, of course, an example of like, if there are probably other people who were impacted. And yeah, if it went to court, they probably settled, but that's a bunch of money and time that people don't have to chase them down.
right.
Uh,
Yeah, don't have time and like don't have the energy for. And it's just so frustrating because there's very little like, I don't actually have very much agency in this situation. And I'm very much the kind of person who's like, well, technically it works if I use Bluetooth headphones. So I guess I'm just going to only ever make and receive phone calls with headphones because otherwise the phone works just fine. Um, yeah. So I'm kind of just like, well, I guess that's the great because I also don't like to just like buy new electronics all the time. I even have like
still got Nate.
yeah, and I have like an old laptop that I used forever. That was actually my partner's when he was in college a million years ago, and it's like our media box and stuff. Like I just tried, but I am gonna build myself a new PC um, because since thankfully, I mean, I don't want to say thankfully because of the pandemic, but like the one thing that I think has been positive is that a lot of places are more open-minded to remote or like accessible work. It pisses me off that for years people with disabilities have been begging for these kinds of accommodations and just been told over and over and over it's not possible, blah blah blah. And then now everybody like can see that the companies were able to do it pretty much as soon as the pandemic started. Um, yeah, that's my tiny rant.
Oh yeah, I could go on for a long time because my job at the Gates Foundation was different than my other jobs because I wasn't making product. I was
Mm-hmm.
really working on like collaboration scenarios and things like that, like improving the way people work together. And so I was, my first year was working on things like researching how we could better help people with our collaborations to move to Teams faster and stuff, and rolling at Teams out instead of Skype to the foundation. And long story short, like everybody, everybody at the foundation was losing like up to like a half hour a day or more to Skype because it was
Mm-hmm.
on premises. All the calls in the world were routing through one place. And so all these problems were happening. And so they thought I would come back and say like SharePoint sucks. And I came back and was like, if you don't replace Skype like a year earlier than anticipated, everyone's going, their souls are going to burst. They're going to like rip into 1,000 pieces. They're like,
Yeah.
great, here's some money, like have a project, go fix it. So we accelerated this whole thing. We had to update all the conference rooms before we could switch over to Teams. We did it. Big long journey, all these challenges. We flipped the switch to move from Skype to Teams, which is fully in the cloud, late February 2020. And then 2 weeks later, we shut down. And so that was such a journey because without user experience, they would not have been ready to, like, it would have been the most horrific work from home experience because we would have had to just like slam everybody over with no preparation, no training, nothing. And then the rest of the time was kind of figuring out what it meant, what was different about working remotely, like how it changed collaboration, all of that stuff. And it's it's fun. It angers me when people like Elon Musk are like, oh, pretending to work. Like that. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but like there are so many people who are more productive at home,
Yeah.
or genuinely putting more of themselves into their work
Yep.
at home because there's like less stress because they're not commuting all the time, or they're able to manage their lives better. But for a variety of reasons, people don't see that. What is what is acknowledged in research to be the worst case is the hybrid scenario.
Mm.
Is when you have some people on one and some people on the other, because then you get little clicks on site. Like it's not that it's impossible, but you have to work really, really hard, and it doesn't free you of
Yeah.
having to work like a remote company. It gives you all the problems of on-site with all the problems of remote. I, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
my current workplace is hybrid, so we have that challenge that we are facing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that's really tough. I also have read a lot of just people talking about like there's a bias against working from home that's very sexist in origin, which is to see like working in the house as less important than work outside of the house. And just there's that. But then I think there's also just a lot of managers, the pandemic kind of made them feel stressed because they were like, if people are doing their job without me needing to stand over them. So I'm like, what is, and it's not to say that managers only do that. Like, I think a lot of project management is not just like cracking a whip and making people do things. It's like helping to orchestrate and communicate and make sure things fit into place. But
people management, like if the good people managers can continue even when they're not in the same.
yeah,
It is more challenging. It is more emotionally draining. Like
yeah,
there's absolutely like facts to that. The way the brain processes video and the way like that stuff is true. But uh, if if you know what you're doing, like if you're intentional as a people manager, like it can still totally work.
yeah, yeah. And I think that there's a book that I really like. Before I was in this job, my main job was I taught like intercultural and interpersonal communication skills, mostly to people in management. Basically taught them like how do you manage, and like a lot of it came down to like I'm going to teach you about your emotions, and I'm going to teach you about like the fact that you assume people can read your mind, even though you don't realize that you assume that you do. Like that was a lot of my job, but I would often have them read this book uh, that was called Lean Logic, and it's written by a guy who the book has been adopted and adapted to be called Surviving the Future, and it's very much about like how to reorganize the world after the market economy ends and stuff like that. And it's different. It's a different kind of book, but the lean logic portion, which is fundamentally about orchestrating people to accomplish big goals, and like we can talk about it on a societal level or even just like a friend group or family or whatever, is really good because it talks about giving everybody at every level of any kind of organization the ability to actually, have agency, to actually make decisions, to be able to say no to things, to create like boundaries. And a lot of workplaces don't include that very much and don't have that as like a default, because we often then just instead have to say like, if I set a boundary with my boss or with my workplace, or if I come in and say I think this thing is unethical, or like this is excluding X group of people, you risk losing your job or just like, annoying the wrong people, and then there's no resolution after that. And I think that that makes workplaces fundamentally much riskier spaces. And just
Yeah,
it makes me sad.
it's seeing that kind. There's so many subtle dynamics inside these big pulsating organizations where people's perceived lack of security influences like the trust and the communication to the point where it can influence the business's ability to succeed.
Yeah.
Like people, it's something as simple as like this person is on a visa and does not have job mobility, means they're not going to communicate as openly when somebody is a toxic manager. They may not speak up about, and that's not their fault. Like that is like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They need a roof over their head. They need to provide for their children. So
Yep.
like inherently, like you can't trust like, well, we have a reporting system. People should report it. Like that's not, it's not a perfect system. I have been happy, pleasantly surprised with the current employer because like a short time in there, I saw like an example of there had been a decision to like, I won't say rush, but like very aggressive timeline, update the branding across the board. And there was like a groundswell movement across many teams saying like, no, just, this is not reasonable right now. No, thank you. You know, from like line employees and then from their managers, and their managers, they pushed up, and it got pushed back by like 6 months. Like CEO level listened, and that got pushed back. And what was really cool was to see that stuff start from like lower levels, people speaking up and saying like, this is not something we can do.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
it's funny too, because when I do ask people to say no, it takes a little bit even then for people to get comfortable with that. Because like, even as a manager, if you want that culture, you have to fight for it. Because many times people are so used to just kind of coping with, they have to do all the things all the time. Like, I'm always very clear with my team. I'm like, okay, we have this new thing coming on. If for a second, let me.
Oh no. Oh, it's frozen on my end.
I have this effect on technology.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Can you say this one more time? Because I lost you right in the middle and I
Okay,
missed some of what you're saying.
sure. So people, if you're a manager and you want to create a space where saying no is part of the culture, you kind of have to fight for it, because a lot of people have been in these environments, but they can't. So you have to make it very clear that that's something you want, and like repeatedly seek it out.
Mm-hmm.
I'm starting to see that on my team now. And even in a place that I've seen actively supports people speaking up, at least now in the post-Kotaku world. Because it's, you're so motivated by, like, you think other people are going to judge you, or you think that a certain amount of output is expected of you. If you want that environment, you have to make sure everybody understands that it's okay.
Yeah.
It's not being held against them, and that you want them to do it. Not just that it's okay, it's not, but it's not a trap.
Yes. This is such a big thing. I mean, like, there's like a million things I want to just like yes and here because it's like, first of all, even if someone can say no to you, if they don't know that they can say no, or they don't believe or feel that they can actually say no, they can't. Like if I, if someone says you can say no to me, but I don't like feel in my body that that's actually true, then I can't actually do it. Um, and then there's the other aspect of just like you want people in your companies or organizations to communicate with you about problems before they blow up and cause a million other problems. You want people to be able to say to you, like, hey, I'm not going to make this deadline. You don't want to wait until after the deadline is passed to find out that the deadline's not going to be made. And it takes a lot of time and effort to build in that culture, get people to actually trust you, but it has such a long-term benefit because it will just then make it so that one, everybody is probably feels more comfortable in the workplace and isn't so stressed out all the time. It will make it so they feel safe to actually communicate with you, but you'll get timely information that will save you money and will save you like letting a client down and or like just so many scenarios. And it just one of the things that also tends to come up is that a lot of people feel like because I know myself and because I know my own mind and my own motivations and I believe that I'm trustworthy, I am one, also then therefore worthy of trust, and two, that other people know these things about me. And people can forget that it takes time and it takes consistency for people to trust you.
Yeah.
And yeah, most people have workplace experiences that give them so much information otherwise. And it just takes a lot of time to get over that.
And there's also the follow up in the first couple of interactions there too. It's not just like making it safe, making sure it's not a trap, but then the first couple of times people do step forward, it's so
Yeah.
critical to like let them know how you're reacting, what actions you are taking, if you are unable to take an action, why you're unable to take an action, and what you would do like to prevent it in the future, all of that stuff. Because if people believe that those first couple interactions, if it just bounces right off you,
Yeah.
that's done. People don't repeat things. People
Yeah.
don't come back. You know, you try an app once and it's broken. Are you download that again? No. You try going to your boss for like support, and your boss is like, you're not going to try that again.
Yeah.
It's because
Yeah.
it's your job, and you want your job to be safe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And it, even if you, I absolutely agree with you. If somebody comes and makes a report to me, like for a lot of events, I help train and run safety teams. And a lot of that includes how do you take a report of like something's going wrong at this company or this event or festival or whatever. Um, like even the Linux Foundation just hired us because they run these huge events and they have constant issues that come up in it, like any event. Like they're doing fine. I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong, but like issues come up and knowing how do you respond to this. And this is one of those core things is like people need to understand that yes, there are different categories of issues. Some things like you immediately eject this person from the space. Some things you just talk to the person and ask them to change their behavior, or you just talk to them and let them know that they've been reported about or there's something wrong. And others, the appropriate course of action is to just say, like, we're going to take note of this. We're going to keep an eye on this person or this situation or whatever, but letting people know that like you've actually heard them, like really heard them, and that you're not just dismissing them is so important. Even if you like, I've had people report things to me that are completely outside of scope. Like I have no ability to even do anything about it, but communicating that to them in a way that says, it's still cool that you came to report to me. It's still cool that you brought this to my attention. You're not foolish or wrong for doing that. And here's the limitations of my role in this situation. And here's like what I can actually offer. Goes a long way to building trust. And it's genuinely so powerful that it sometimes can be surprising. Like within the Seattle swing dance community, I was the kind of the safety person a lot of the time. So then people who were from other cities, other styles of dance, like eventually kind of heard about me and would report things to me on Facebook. And I would just be like, I don't dance bachata and I have no ability to decide if this dude comes to your events. But if you want, I can help you find the person who can make the decision and talk with them. But like, but the thing is like, this is not like a bad story. To me, this is like, there's so much need for not just in workplaces, but definitely in workplaces for any kind of just like acknowledging that things can go wrong and that things can be done when something goes wrong and that it's okay.
That it's like the experience is meaningful. I think that's part of like, yeah, you and I have been working with a group called the Online Creators Association. I'm an administrator over there. I'm doing some like grant work with them, but that group formed because we had a bunch of disparate TikTok creators experiencing similar things and TikTok just not listening, right? Like you're getting support tickets bounced, legal's not responding to things, and we needed some way to come together and feel heard, feel like if they're not doing something, could someone do something?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people, that stress is so significant until they can go to someone like people going to you when from the random like samba community or something.
Right.
But and what's been cool there is kind of like taking that first feeling, like a bunch of people wanting to go to somewhere, and Cecilia Gray, who's been like running the whole thing, turning it into like a nonprofit that exists to take all of our learnings and kind of share them back with TikTok and maybe the rest of the tech community. Like, hey, these are ways you could not continue to marginalize people.
Yeah. I think that I didn't get a chance to talk about the specific aspect of it the other day when I was on their interview stream, but it's a really, I think the online creators, is it Alliance? Or yeah, okay. For some reason, that one word, I was like, it could be like 4 different ones.
You just go by Toga.
Yeah, Toga. Very good. I think is a great acronym. Anyway, that there's a really important principle on display there, which is that we always are going to need different types of systems. And if a organization or a community is not providing that system, somebody will. And it often will. Toka is great, but a lot of the time the things that do get produced are not great. That's where you get things like whisper networks, or like if there's no way to sort of report about issues, or if the system that does exist doesn't work, that's where you get the like big public call outs on social media. And then that's where you get like just so many, and for every one person who does the big public call out on social media, you can imagine there are tens of people who experience the same thing, and you lost them either off your platform, out of your organization, out of your like subcultural community, whatever, and that's always a loss. And you don't, it's always just the tip of the iceberg. So if you don't have any kind of system for reporting, or this reporting system doesn't work, the community is going to make one, and it's going to be more difficult than if you just actually bake it into the organizational structure as well. And I hope that Toka is able to really get TikTok to start to take these things more seriously. Um, I had a client years ago who was one of the AI engineers at TikTok, and I try to talk about some of these sort of ethical issues about like things like, you know, anybody who's fat just like not getting their videos promoted.
Oh, yeah.
And what this person said to me was like, well, that's also a consent thing because not everybody wants to have to see fat people. And I was just like,
Oh my God.
okay, so like you're the person working on this, and this is your perspective. And I was just like, cool, we have a lot of work to do together.
Explains so much.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
much.
And like,
Oh.
yeah, it does explain a
And
lot.
now we have these feedback bubbles.
Yeah.
And that's the blessing and the curse of TikTok is you get these hyper specific communities like Frog Talk or something that we joke about. Where, but when you have these insular communities, because people can just like shove the rest of reality off into a corner, that's how you get like I think it was Cecilia that had run an experiment and kind of radicalized an account in like 2 hours or something. That's how fast the algorithm is so responsive to people just indicating what they don't want to see, that you just give people probably too harmfully a narrowed vision of the world. And it's such a complicated concept, right? Like TikTok is such a difficult beast to detangle, which is why Toga does focus a lot of our efforts on TikTok, and we all met there. But like, if you broaden the conversation a little bit and just look at tech again, I think it's very valuable for any tech company to ask themselves what community will serve the people who use your product.
Yeah.
In some cases, your product is big enough that it needs its own communities, right? Like it's going to cut, like in other cases, like at Riot, we don't want to replace communities. Like we want to serve communities, right? There are already groups of gamers. There's a bunch of people on Discord. We would like to serve those groups. So how do we best set them up for success? And that's, but if you don't understand whether or not you're serving existing communities or whether your app is going to become a force big enough that it kind of needs to acknowledge it is a community, and serve it in that way, then you end up in this weird ground. And TikTok for a very long time, like almost vehemently tried to resist community, right? Like you couldn't reply to comments, you couldn't like thread videos in any way, and so people were doing anything in their power to create community, despite TikTok's best efforts. We're trying so hard. It was fascinating, like 2019, like people were trying, so they're creating these hashtag communities, and they had so few tools to do it. But so if you don't understand, like if there is no community that's actively going to be supporting your tool, you are the community. So what are you doing about it?
Yeah. I think that that's a really important point, which is like recognizing that, structures will form and groups will form around things. And one, that's always a place where if you want to appeal to the business, you can make money by actually interacting with these things and better serving them and like giving them the tools that they want for the ways they want to interact with your, whatever. And on the other hand, it's like, just as a kind of side point, when I think about things like just like pure moderation, it is not lost on me how difficult it is for any of these big platforms to do moderation, because they're just like hundreds and hundreds of posts every second. And I know that things like Facebook do a lot of like brute force moderation, where you just have individuals looking at really traumatic things all day, every day, and having to make really rapid fire decisions about if a post or a comment violates something or doesn't. And that's rough. Like, there's no getting around that. And trying to then, like text analysis algorithm your way into like moderating is also really difficult and problematic, and like creates some of the things that happens with TikTok, which is like, and YouTube and stuff, which is people, instead of saying like, certain words, they replace them with these other words. And it's like, thankfully I don't really think about that as much, because for Consent Academy, this is just a different type of outreach to kind of be on mission. It doesn't matter if we make money from advertising revenue. It's amazing when we do. It's like great. It definitely helps us as a nonprofit, because like most nonprofits, we don't have very much money, but it's not the main focus. So if a video I post gets demonetized, I'm just kind of like, cool. Yeah, I mean, what I'm talking about is probably more important than the like 75 cents I would have made off of the commercials. But it can also result in things getting taken down, or like, I don't want to say censorship because it's too loaded of a word, but
We can't, I mean, the word suppression gets used a lot in our communities, but
yeah.
you can't say whether or not it's like politically motivated, but what you can generally, sometimes it's a gut feeling, and sometimes you can like mathematically show that particular content is either not being shown or very infrequently being shown.
Yeah, yeah.
And it
And
gets super fascinating on TikTok too, because one of the big things that drew us together is this whole arc in 2020 where there was the blackout in May 2020, where Black creators kind of did a takeover of the FYP, the For You page. And it was very successful. Like, I found so many Black creators that I wasn't following, and it was like got me out of one of those little bubbles I was in. It was fantastic. But then TikTok got real scared, because if they could take over the For You page, everybody could.
yeah.
So they started locking down the way the For You page served things. And, and so we noticed that later attempts to do hashtag awareness campaigns were not nearly as successful. And then we started to notice that really weird behavior around current events, like large scale hashtag suppression. And we'd start to get a bunch of likes on our really old content, like 3 month, 6 month old content. And so, like, there's no transparency at TikTok. So you do find a lot of this, like, hey, maybe it's scanning the audio, so we'll have to come up with new words or something. We don't have concrete evidence about these things, but a theory that has gotten a lot of legs with us is that when they believe a controversial event is about to happen, they will lock it down and serve only like the majority proven viral content, or content that's not tagging anywhere near the issue that they believe is going to be sensitive at the time.
Yeah.
So when we start getting likes on old content, all of us are like, oh, what's happening today? What's going on?
That's fascinating. That's really, really, really fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I think it's also, it kind of comes back to an earlier point, which is that like when you're running into a lot of these issues, organizations, my advice to them would always be like, slow down, especially in terms of your growth. Like, I know that that's tough with the way we've got, like, you need to get returns for your investors, et cetera, et cetera. But like, slow it down a little bit. Like, one of the things that actually pushed me off TikTok for a long time was just how many people would be on there giving like medical advice, but stuff that I was like, this will get you killed, or like, this is genuinely not true, or this is like really unsafe. And they would be some of the like most popular sort of like medical things, or it would be like these. I think about some of these content farms on YouTube that make like life hack videos. And one of the worst ones is like cooking eggs in the microwave, which tends, if you do that, the egg actually tends to explode. And there's been hundreds of children who've seen a video on TikTok or on YouTube of like cook an egg in, you crack the egg, put it in water, cook it in your microwave, it comes out, it explodes, and they get terrible burns on their faces.
Oh my God.
Like, you know, like life changing kinds of burns. And then I just think about how, like, this is a constant thing at YouTube, and not a lot is done about it. And you've got these like larger content farm companies that are based in like, you know, like China or Korea, that are just pumping out this stuff basically to get advertising revenue. But a lot of it's stuff that's like, if you try to do the hack, it doesn't work, or it's actually dangerous. And I don't know, this is kind of a digression, but it makes me very stressed and sad, both on TikTok.
There's no consequences
Right.
for slowing down and asking what's the worst thing that could happen if this is successful.
Exactly. And I wish that, you know, there's a YouTuber that I really like called How to Cook That. And her whole deal is like, she takes these viral videos that are on TikTok or YouTube or whatever of like cooking hacks and life hacks. And then she tests them and sees like, do they actually work? And then if they don't, she'll be like, okay, but then here's probably what you could do instead that would get you closer to the results it's claiming, or like, this thing isn't actually possible. And she's got a lot of really good analysis about the companies that are behind a lot of these more dangerous content that ends up being on there. Anyway, it's a digression, but it's a fascinating thing. And I wish there were more accountability even from the platforms themselves, just to be like,
we need like a big Mythbusters enterprise for the TikTok era.
Yeah, we do. We do. And we really need like just some amount of understanding from the people who run these platforms that like there are real life consequences to the things that get promoted on their sites. You know, it's kind of a parallel example, but I was talking to someone recently who runs this festival. And after their last festival, they got all this feedback that really frustrated them, because they were like, I was getting complaints because random other participants misgendered random other participants, and like, I have no control over that. Or like, the teachers that I hired said something that was like slightly heteronormative, and then people are really angry, and it's like, I can't be held responsible for the things that my educators say. And I'm like, well, you picked them and you brought them in, and like, yeah, you can't like sit with them in every workshop to watch everything they say, to like cut the microphone the second it's, and like, my advice to this person was slow down. Like, don't have 3 festivals back to back, one a month, when you're, if you don't have the time to actually vet the people to that level, if you don't actually have the time to like, if you want to serve a community that has these concerns, and you do like want to serve them, slow down how quickly you grow, how many, you know, events you put on, how many educators you bring in. Take some time to actually vet them, make sure what they're doing aligns with your ethos and your values and your mission. And then, you know, allow the growth to be a little slower. And it's the same kind of thing I would love to see from these bigger platforms, because it is a type of accountability. It's like, we will slow our profit margin for the sake of keeping people safer, of reducing the risks of extreme radicalization, of just like making it so little kids don't get terrible burns on their faces. And I
But
think
you also need people inside that have the catastrophic imagination to say like, this is a risk factor.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is part of what like I'm trying to do in my book, is give people that, and coming back to like the way we're getting for designers, and like, ask those questions early. It's like, imagine what's the worst thing that can happen if you're successful. And in the case you're describing, like, okay, what's the worst that happens if I have all these instructors? I don't understand. Like, I don't, I get it wrong for one instructor. Okay, how do we cope with that?
Mm-hmm.
How do we assume that that success is going to happen and cope with that? Maybe there are tester classes where we don't charge and instead we're asking for people who get the class for free, but acknowledge that we are asking them for their feedback on the instructor.
Yeah.
And there may be a risk of being exposed to content that they may not approve of.
Yeah. Or just like, with like organizations that have performances that they put on, my recommendation to them is like, if you're going to hire somebody to come do a performance at your event, have them send you a recording of the performance they're going to do ahead of time. It doesn't have to be, it can be like they're just blocking it out or whatever, but you don't want to like have them show up and then they're wearing something incredibly racist and you're just like, well, too late now. Like you can vet these things ahead of time. It's just, this is one of those other things that gets people, I think, really stressed about these ideas of these changes, because they just start to imagine that this is going to be so much more work that for not a lot of return, that people, I feel, can be really resistant to taking the time to like put in a little bit more safety or do a little bit more like actual, diversity and inclusion work, not just sort of lip service. Yeah, it's this and then it's fine. And if the people want to be here, they'll be here. It's like, are you actually making space for people? Are you actually serving the communities that you want to engage with whatever you're making? And I think that it's complicated. Um, so then, different question that I have. I want to talk about another very cool and interesting aspect of your life and these same issues in your improv work. And because I think that improv, I want to bring it up, one, because it's cool and like Star Trek improv, this is amazing, but also I've seen in things like arts communities and other sort of like less purely formal hierarchical sort of organizations, the same problems play out, um, with different challenges to sort of overcoming them. And I'd love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think there's the micro, the challenges within the scope of the scene or a class. And then you move towards the macro, which are the challenges in established companies and organizations in the arts. And improv is particularly problematic, risky. Let's use the word risky instead of problematic, because it is volatile.
Mm-hmm.
It is unpredictable. Like, it's you in a theater doing scripted work, you should have the structures in place to know what show you're doing and to have more control over like the alignment of people and roles, to figure out whether or not this is going to be something that's wise and aligned with community standards and everything. In improv, you don't necessarily know what's going to happen that night, and so that gets used as a shield.
Mm-hmm.
People are like, well, we didn't know that was going to happen that night. You expose yourself to some risk by showing up, being in the thing. And I was technically still, like, I've been a professional improviser for since like 2005, so a long time. And I've taught and I've done a ton of performance and I've directed. And teaching is really interesting because you have to get past that crutch for some folks who believe that being inside the scope of the scene allows them to do anything. People who and consent, when you think about consent in improv, you may think immediately like on stage intimacy, which is totally a thing that you have to work through.
Yeah.
But it can also be topics around sexuality and physical contact and physical space. And as an instructor, you always need, like, you need to be upfront about what the ground rules are for your students, and then very attuned to find out where the subtleties are. Because there's the baseline rules, like everything above the belt, no kissing, none of the things. But then there are going to be students who have unexpressed concerns, or and even if you say like, hey, if you don't, if you're not comfortable with something, please speak up. Same as I mentioned before,
Mm-hmm.
you often have to fight for it
Yeah.
because people don't feel like it's safe, or they don't feel like you actually mean it. So like watching for people being uncomfortable, watching for people, like, and it's really tough as an instructor, because you're like, is that an acting? Is it in character? Or is that the human being that's responding to the thing?
Yeah, that's a
Uh,
very interesting challenge.
and then there's the, like, you can also go by the actor who's sort of instigating the potentially problematic thing, is like, would this be problematic all the time, or is it something I can engage on immediately, or is this a contextual thing where I have to understand more about the perspective of the person receiving before I like do any kind of key intervention? So it's very tricky, but like as a general rule, that we respect is important, and uh, and I think as improvisers today, we need to be very aware that like you can't say you don't see race, and you can't say you don't see gender. Like your audiences see those, even
Yeah.
if you don't. Like I've seen it happen where actors who think that they are woke because they don't see race make choices, and the audience sees the choices and they land differently. And
Yeah.
you have to be aware that those, like, you put a black actor in a role that just reinforces stereotypes, the audience is like, why did you do that? Like, you
Yeah.
have to allow, you don't have to do things, but the audience, depending on your audience and where you are, your choices will land for your audience based on the way that where they are on their journey.
Yeah.
And your choices have impacted the world. So know what impact you want to have in the world, because you're an entertainer, you have power, you're on stage, you're telling stories. Stories impact people emotionally. The stories are the things people carry around with you. I have had scenes that I did 10 years ago brought up by people. I don't remember those scenes, but they still remember the Apple Squirrel Ballet thing. I'm like, I have no recollection of that, but that's stuck with them.
Mm-hmm.
So your particular stand on something in a scene might be the thing, the squirrel ballet, that they remember for 10 years. So
Yeah.
as you move towards performance, there's impacts you can have on an individual performer, and there's impacts you can have on an entire audience. And then there's the organizational challenges. I had a good 13 years with the company I was with, and then on the last night I was with my company, non-consensual interaction occurred with like 70 of my friends and family watching, and the way it was handled was very inappropriate. Like when I asked for, I brought it up with the performer over email that night, and he apologized directly. So this wasn't about calling him out, but I had been, there was a very sexually explicit song about me, interrupting like the thanks for my service to the company for 13 years.
Ugh.
And and friends and family had seen that. So I felt that the only appropriate thing for the company was to acknowledge that this behavior was not acceptable or condoned, and to apologize.
Yeah.
But that request to the company was ignored and pushed up multiple times, despite the fact that I was a member of the staff. Like I was a director for them. I've been a teacher for them, like just dismissed. And, and then I asked again. They came back after like 4 weeks, and they were like, hey, heard you still had some concerns. Do you want to talk? I'm like, well, if you're taking action, we can talk, but I'm not interested in just having you tell me that, like, trying to talk me down. Like, I'm very clear about what needs to happen in this situation. And they did not move forward with talking, because it was clear all they wanted to do was just try to like talk the silly woman around from thinking these things. And so I made the difficult choice. I was still planning on working with that company remotely when I moved to LA, but I made the difficult choice to resign because I didn't feel like they had my best interests at heart. I didn't feel like safe continuing. And then I sent my resignation letter to the company, and then there were public responses over the company mailing list that were inappropriate and exposed the fact that leadership didn't even really see the original incident as necessarily inappropriate.
Wow.
So, and then they threatened. I don't think they saw it as a threat, but they basically thought posting the original video as a lesson to other folks, which is basically threatening to re-traumatize me. So it was a hot, super hot mess.
Wow.
So we've been playing, and you know, and this is an organization that has had many meetings about sexual harassment guidelines, about consent on stage, has dedicated people to talk to about these things, that believed that they were past these problems. But when decisions come down to one individual's perception of the severity of an incident, when we're not listening to the victims and about the impact of the incident, you know, when we're not considering the various like interactions of gender and power and things along those lines, you're not past it.
Yeah.
And that's, and then it got super complicated because then a bunch of other people were contacting me and thanking me for doing it because they had experienced things that they didn't feel comfortable raising. I'm like, oh boy,
Wow.
okay. And then another company in the community posted publicly supporting me, but had not contacted me about this. And they upset members of their community because they had a similar incident prior, and they had never followed up with the people who had been targets of behavior there. So I got a statement of support, but they never supported their own people. And I would have, you know, and I would have appreciated, like, so like, it was terrible. And I'm like moving to Los Angeles and having a new job, and it was like a complete and utter nightmare for me. But there are some really important lessons about improv and consent and things along those lines. First of all, like, we're no longer in the place. First of all, that was a song, an inappropriately sexualized song sung about me.
Yeah.
That wasn't in the context of the character. So right off the bat, like, that's the thing that this, I as a human had no choice, that no ability to consent to that interaction.
Yeah.
And you would say, like, just step up and stop it. But to the point we were saying earlier, like, I'm on stage in front of a paid audience of over 100 people. I don't know if this is a bit. I don't know if other people are coming on and scheduling it. And the audience may turn on me if I cut this off. Suddenly now I'm the bad guy if I go in and cut this off. So there's that whole thing. It's not as simple as just expecting the victim to speak up. I definitely experienced the freeze and the fight or flight situation where, like, afterwards I didn't know how to confront it, how I was still like just trying to process what had happened. And so it took me a couple hours before I could mention what it was.
Yeah.
And then there's the larger question of what happens in scenes, which is a lot of what was brought to me offline afterwards, where people repeatedly, and I, you know, cast members who just always try to manipulate scenes into a place where there's intimacy with you or something like that.
Yeah.
And so for those you need, and I think we were a little bit better there, but obviously not perfect, about trying to be upfront about the fact that you need structural consent for those sorts of things. And that as a company, we support it if you avoid or block those sorts of offers.
Yeah.
But it is complicated. And I've had some not great experiences.
Sounds like it. I mean, this is definitely just an absolute mess of an experience, start to finish. And I unfortunately have to say that this is a very familiar story. Not just because I remember when you were posting about it, but like, we get at Consent Academy like consulting requests because an individual or an organization has gone through almost this exact same thing, and then they're just like, we messed up, what do we do? And or like, how do we not have the same thing happen again? And when they tell us the stories, it sounds so much like this. And it's, you know, it's always the hope of, at least I hope it's the hope of any nonprofit to eventually go out of business because you're not needed anymore. You know, like, you don't want to be part of the like nonprofit industrial complex. And with Consent Academy, I'm like, we're probably going to be needed long after I'm dead. Like, these issues, there's so much that needs to be done. I think just the idea that you can be past needing to think about consent. Some people pointed out in chat that it's itself a red flag. Even like we do not say that we are like experts in consent because you can always be better. There's always better consent practice that you can do. And people also forget that you have to practice to get even decent at consent. Like it's something that takes effort, that takes intentional thought, and each person you interact with is going to be different. And learning to deal with mistakes in a way that's like also consensual. Like if you violate someone's boundary or you do something they don't like, not then immediately freezing up or getting defensive, just being like, oh yeah, thank you for letting me know. And then you update your consent framework with that person. This is all so important. And, it's so tricky too because like there's so many different layers of consent. I think a lot of times people think, oh, well, the solution to this would be to like just talk about it beforehand and get your agreement. But like, unless you get to hear the whole song ahead of time, one, that's still very risky. And two, like you might agree to something beforehand and then in the moment realize, actually, I'm uncomfortable with this. This isn't what
The
I
audience
thought.
responds in an unexpected way or something.
Right.
That wasn't the case here. It was just wildly inappropriate the whole time.
Right.
And this was a performer that I did have, we did have the consent in scenes for on stage intimacy, and that performer abused that consent
Mm-hmm.
to cross the line to this personal place.
Yeah.
In this scenario. So just because you have consent in one context, does that mean
Exactly.
that it transfers broadly?
Yeah. And just, like you can have, how do I want to say this? At Consent Academy, a couple of our perspectives, like our consent framework, we always talk about it as a risk reduction framework because no matter how good the like consent is, there's always still risk that it's whatever's happening is not actually consensual. And we also talk about like consent is not about perfect rules and pre-planning. It's about feeling. Like literally consent means with feeling. Like con is with, sent is the word for like sentiment, and that means feeling. And the idea is it's supposed to be that like it feels correct in your body, not just in your mind. It's not just about the rules. And this is something that I think makes this duality that we tend to have between our brain and our body makes it so a lot of people question their own sense of consent, where they're like, they can feel in their body something's not quite right, but then they're like, well, logically, like I said yes to this, or logically, that's just the way things are, logic, like whatever. And that's also makes it harder for people to notice quickly and respond quickly to when non-consensual things are happening. But it also makes it so that when people are getting told that something was non-consensual, they have to like throw out the idea of like how they would respond to the same thing, or like what does the rule say, or like whatever, because it's not ever about that. It's about how did the people in the situation actually feel about what was happening, and like did it feel correct in their body. I mean, sometimes people don't like when we use that kind of idea because it feels a little too like hippie and like wishy-washy to them, but it's also still true. And the other thing is that like consent is rarely black and white. It's usually much more gray, and discovery is often a part of it too. Like perfect pre-planning, one is never going to be perfect. It can help reduce the risk a lot, but like someone could explain to me exactly what's going to happen. Like we're going to go on this roller coaster ride or something, and they can tell me beat for beat everything, and I'm imagining it. I'm like, yeah, that sounds cool. And then I get in there, and it's my imagining of what was going to happen doesn't match reality, and then I'm like, oh no, I don't like this. Or like someone makes a delicious meal for me and it smells amazing and I think I want to eat it, and then I take a bite and it's too salty, right? Like there's it's you can't know how something's going to land or what it's going to feel like until you're in that moment, or sometimes until you're processing it later. And people really just, you're everyone trying to basically just say, oh, silly lady, don't feel this way about this thing, is not surprising because we want consent to be hard and fast rules that are about perfect logic, that are immediately understandable, not things that are like complicated and gray and take time to process. And like, as you said, consent in one situation doesn't translate to consent in another. And
I
yeah,
had someone in chat who mentioned like, oh, I bet it would have been worse hearing the song in private than on stage. That's the thing. Different people will have different metrics there. Some people might be more physically threatened by it being in private. For me, it was the harm caused by that demonstration to people who didn't normally see me perform, and that basically seeing like, hey, this 15 years that Cheryl's been doing this, she's basically been debasing herself.
yeah,
Like that's, I had coworkers, I had my parents were watching that stream. That's the harm that was done there. So, it's very much about the person receiving, and
yep.
that's going to be, and the situation, and it's going to be different for everybody. But it is usually reasonable to tell like what the class of things is. Like you can't always, there is a class of things that is high risk, to your point, risk mitigation.
Yeah.
Anything sexualized, high risk. Go with caution. And then there's some things that are medium risk where you might not know a subject that's going to be a problem for someone. But yeah, and that was, that's not funny, but like the ironic thing about this whole situation was like, when I contacted the performer about it afterwards, he was very like apologetic and remorseful, and like reflected on it about how he had not considered my perspective in the whole thing. So this was never about like him. I was asking to get the harm ameliorated from the organization because the harm was public. So the response should be public.
Yes.
But what happened was the response centered the staff because they interpreted my request as a personal attack against them.
Mm-hmm.
And and to your point, it's all like, well, I didn't feel like the song was that problematic. Like, well, were you standing on stage? Are you a woman?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is it your last day at the company? Were your parents watching? Like, what? Like, I don't think you're qualified to make that assumption.
Right.
And then several of the following responses were like, using the I terminal, like it's very clear that the staff was viewing this as like it was never about the staff. It was about ameliorating the like. That's a big problem, I think, and maybe you see this too. But to me, I see this being a problem, like the difference between asking for organizational response and like asking for individual response. And when people conflate that, that's where the defensiveness happens, and that's where things get super messy. I mean, there's a lot of, that's not always the case, but in this case, that's what I feel like a lot of it was it could have gone so much more smoothly if an individual had just said, you're right, the organization is going to respond. This isn't about me, but that was not what happened.
Yeah. That's one of those, one of the biggest things that I often end up giving to people as advice in general is helping them understand that there are many times where it is not about them. It has nothing to do with them. And that like making it about yourself is harmful itself a lot of the time. Like, everything from if I'm trying to tell somebody, hey, this thing you were saying to me was like ableist or racist or whatever. And then they think that it's about them and then they cry and then the conversation does become about them, to like me trying to say to like my university, hey, there's a structural issue with disability services and the ways in which the professors are educated on their legal requirements to provide accommodations. And then the first thing they worry about is that I'm going to sue them, and they like lawyer up. And it's like, okay. And I think this defensiveness ends up becoming such a problem. And as people have pointed out in chat, it is a barrier to progress, and it's just so sad because it also, I think, makes the situation more stressful for the person who thinks it's about them as well, and difficult. So then you never got any sort of actual accountability from the organization, right?
I eventually got an apology posted on Facebook, which wasn't as extensive as I wanted, but at least it was something. But that only came with the intervention of the board.
Yeah.
And theoretically, I've been told by some cast members that there was additional action being taken on audits, but you know how that goes. Like, what was revealed when the defensiveness triggered a series of events was that there were structural problems about the way people in power were processing reports, and that had systemically resulted in problematic enforcement of the policies. My perception is that the organization would find it too difficult to take action on that finding. So I don't have a lot of hope that like meaningful action's gonna come from it.
Yeah.
But so and that whole experience was super traumatizing. Like I couldn't stop thinking about it for weeks and weeks and weeks.
Yeah.
And it still breaks my heart. I've worked with that company for, a decade and a half. And I worked so hard for them, and to have that be the end, and then, yeah, people in leadership just not, yeah, it was very, very harmful.
Yeah. I imagine in that kind of space too, it's also hard to not have that experience retroactively color all of the previous experiences you had as well.
People that you thought were your friends who just get defensive, like, individuals who that very day posted like memes about how people who tell their story are the bravest and then never respond about this thing to support. You're like, oh, okay, I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. That's always so tough. It's also tough when like, I've had similar, not particularly like a sort of this type of like sexualized end to a career or anything. Plenty of times when I've like left a job, my boss wants to be like, "Hey, I always hoped we'd get together." It's like the last thing they say to me, and I'm like, "No, just I don't usually dignify it with a response. I just walk away because that kind of thing is quite common." But I think I can imagine just how rough that is, especially because the people watching that you cared about, their perception of things didn't have the context to even know that this was not the way normally things went, and that somebody thought this was a good idea, but is not what you normally agreed to. But I think it's really tough when any kind of like, I guess we could call it a community harm, like when something goes wrong that causes a harm, usually even just between two people, but they're very embedded in a larger context of like a group of friends, or like, a role-playing game group or a sports team or an office. And then this is one of the other things that I think is on leadership to help manage, is the idea that like creating healthy structures to protect the long-term sustainability and health of the community is also something that's on leadership. And most of the time what I've seen is defensiveness, or just like essentially dissociation from it, just being like, I'm just going to wait till it goes away so I don't have to actually make a statement. I don't actually want to think about it. One of the classes that we have for leadership, we talk about the difference between like problems, difficulties, and challenges. Like a problem is a situation that actually has a solution. Like someone's late for work all the time might have the solution of like giving them a public transit pass so they're not stuck in traffic, so that they can afford to like take the train every day. And then like a difficulty is something that can only ever be managed, like people on your teams don't always like each other, so you create structures to help manage interpersonal tension. And then challenges are things that are like lifelong journeys, like undoing internalized sexism or racism or homophobia. And like sometimes there are problems and difficulties within the bigger challenges, but those are things that like it's going to be a lifelong effort to create any kind of change there, and seeing things on these different levels. And sometimes I wish I could just like broadcast this kind of tool to so many people, because I feel like that when these kinds of issues come up, if they could have even just take a pause and sort of break down the layers of what's happened. What are the things that we actually have control over? What are the things that we don't? Where are the places where we can create structure? Where are the places that we can't? What are the things that we do need to take accountability for? What are the things that would be cool if we did, but we probably won't? And what are the things that are genuinely outside of the scope of our accountability? And just like not getting so scared of like what these things mean would be so helpful.
Understanding that you have to grow, and none of us, OPC Whistler had mentioned earlier that like people viewing it as black or white, like you're a bad person the minute you make a misstep on one of these things, as opposed to saying like, yeah, I will learn from it and grow. Did I have as nuanced a perspective on race relations now, like 10 years ago as I did now? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
But I've had a lot of opportunities to grow and hope to continue to get better.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be any good to the world if I just like tossed all the tables and said like, well, I just have to maintain the same worldview because if I don't, I would be a bad person always and forever. And it's like, okay, well, that sucks that I didn't know as much then, and I'm going to know more now. But Jakey had mentioned speaking up at a few places and nothing got done. And I just wanted to say, like, been there.
Yeah.
And even when the short term doesn't result in action, like to Arya's point, on these challenges and these difficulties, these longer term journeys, sometimes you speaking up starts the snowball, or it helps it get bigger. Especially when you're a person with more of a position of privilege or power, where you're like part of the less marginalized genders or something along those lines. People see that, and it creates a small step towards a safer environment. Sometimes people tell you that this has happened, sometimes people don't. And they just don't feel safe enough telling you that it helped, but it did. People who are abusers continue to abuse because they do not feel threatened. They feel like the organization will support their abuse. So the more people stand up, not like punch them in the face, but stand up and say like, this behavior is wrong. This behavior is against our standards. This behavior violates our policies publicly. That increases the risk to the individual that they continuing to perpetrate the harm will bring harm back to them. And it's all about risk management. Like they're doing it because they think they're getting more benefit than risk in that scenario. So the more we speak up, the better. And so like I did, and I will never know what it's like being a Black woman. I will never know. But like seeing just like the response to just me speaking out a little bit about this thing, which I didn't want to do, didn't want to get involved in, didn't want this to happen.
Yeah.
But like people stepping up and being like, this is so helpful. Thank you so much for giving this voice to things. And you see so many Black women solving so many problems in society. Like I can't speak for them, but I suspect it's a very tiring thing. And that many of these difficulties they're fighting, they don't want to be fighting. And you're just there. And the more support you can give these people who didn't want to fight these battles in the first place, it's just speaking up a little bit in a moment, so helpful. Because those people who are speaking up are like, because of the trauma happening, are under duress. The emotional strain, physical strain, economic strain. So if you are in a position of relative comfort and you see something like that going down and you can speak up, it makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's so many things I want to yes and to what you were just saying. I think that, helping to make the path open, even if you don't get very far, still makes it so the next person who's trying to go on that journey is going to have the path a little bit more cleared. And so this is another example of like, in activism, remembering that it's not about you can be really helpful. Sometimes I say this and people think I'm like judging them or it's like really harsh or dismissive. But what I'm trying to actually say here is like, it's one of the things that helps you not get as worn down by trying and things not happening is like remembering it's not about you. Systems are very resistant to change. There's so much more stuff in support of the status quo, and the impact you're going to have, it's still going to open the door for other people to then take more of a step in. And it's still worthwhile, even if you don't get the results that you're looking for, because it does create this positive path forward. And it's so important to do those things. And then like, just being in coalition with other people. I brought these two things up, the like remembering you're not alone, and it's also not about you, as with Toka, with trying to change like, these big corporate algorithm structures and whatnot, is like it can feel really daunting and overwhelming, but there are always other people out there also doing the work. And like being in coalition with them can really help push things forward as well and can help make change. And it's also just really important to work together in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. And I think like going through it and like trying to write the open letter, I had to remind myself so much in the emotional moment, like it is not about me. Like the
Mm-hmm.
reason I'm writing this open letter is not because like it's past that. Like I wanted the apology. If the apology happens, it's not going to change my actions. And right now, it's like I care about this organization and I want this to be fixed. So how do I make sure that I'm telling the right, the right, focusing on the right parts and removing the parts that are like super specific to me where they don't add context, so that you can work in coalition, so that it feels like we are united towards something that matters to more than one person,
Yeah.
and create that positive momentum instead of hyper focusing on, something that like fix my problem. No, there's problems that are valuable to solve, and like this event, while super crappy, is a stepping stone towards solving a problem that is affecting multiple people.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that building the coalition, if you can look at it in that way, that's how you build coalition and move a step towards meaningful change when you're in the middle of crappy things.
Yeah. And on top of that, I do also want to say that like there are times where it is about one person and like that person does need to be the focus in the center. And like I know that there have been complaints even like within contemporary, Black rights movements, with individuals who've been, say, the victims of police or gun violence and their families getting angered because these larger coalition organizations make money off of and gain notoriety and like do these things with this person's image without, say, like involving the family or the person who was affected. And I think that that's not great. That's not
That's
consensual.
very true.
Like, and our definition of consent is based off of autonomy, which is the idea that you have the right to decide not just for your own body, but your mind, your spirit, your information, and your story. Like what happens with those things. So other people can't just like take them and weaponize them as they want. But then similarly, if we think about sort of like principles from transformative justice, for example, you have multiple layers of transformation. So like the person who caused harm, like this actor in this situation, is responsible to like understand what was wrong, why it happened, what impact it had, work to change their behavior so it doesn't happen again, but also to make amends if possible. But then the organization is responsible for their transformation around like what structures did they create? But then you would also have to have your own process for your own healing, where that part of the whole sort of justice framework there, that would be about you. And that would be about like, what do you need in these spaces to feel safe again in the improv community and to, do these things that are inherently riskier but are very fun and rewarding and creative and like, important, and also to like feel good again in these spaces and to get past certain types of like thinking about it creates this like intense feeling or whatever. And so like all of those things exist at the same time. And then there's also the sort of like community level accountability and transformation. Like what does the community need to do and learn and create structure around to make sure that like people respond to this kind of harm appropriately as well, not just within the organization, but and all the people around it. Um, I know this is like very philosophical way of looking at the situation, but I think that it's still relevant to like what could have gone better, how it could have been handled in a healthier manner from the people who had a lot of power. to respond to it. Yeah. Um, are you going to say something?
No.
No, no. Okay. I was just, you looked like you were going to say something, but I think that, yeah, I'm sorry that you had to deal with that. It's just, I feel very frustrated on your behalf. Um, so then what would you like, thinking about all of these different levels that we've talked about, everything from like user interface design and accessibility and workplaces and accessibility and just like accountability and consent in, all different types of communities, what do you think is sort of future of these discussions, and what is your sort of vision for how things could be better, maybe?
I would love to see people better at asking the right questions at the right times. And the expansion of the growth mindset as opposed to the fixed mindset. That fixed mindset being, well, I've had these values and these behaviors and they're not going to change. And if you challenge one of them, then that means I've been a bad person. I will always be a bad person.
Mm-hmm.
But those are all nice wishes to have. The things that I encourage people, like the behavior change, I try to like model. Some of it is that off the pessimism, like you can decide how much you want to apply, but at its very core, just like what are the worst consequences of success and how do we cope with that? Remembering that even just something happening to a few people is impacting real humans. And in tech, something happening to a percentage of people can still be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. And so, like, you can't, it's very dangerous to just wave your hand and abstract things away.
Mm-hmm.
And that applies to exclusion too. If you're just excluding a small percentage of people, that's still potentially a lot of people. And when we talk about accessibility, 25% of the population has a disability of some kind. So just saying like, that's,
Mm-hmm.
it's not, it's just, to your point, not a great fiscal move in addition to just not a great human move.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, one thing I'd very much like to see continue to transform over time. I mean, there's lots of other things, but like I think coming back to that is that like, how do we figure out what the worst consequences of success are, build to that. And then the other side of pessimism is like understanding that we will never be able to fix everything.
Mm-hmm.
Like there will always be things that go wrong. All of life is improv.
Yes.
Like you've never solved the problem. So how do you respond when something you didn't expect was wrong? Like how do you maintain that open mindset? That's the other side of it. Like what's the worst, like what's the best way you could respond to the worst case you didn't think of?
Yeah.
And how do you put those systems in place?
Yeah. I think I really like that. This is something I do enjoy about talking with you is even though we have such different sort of like educational and work backgrounds, I think we've come to a lot of similar conclusions about like creating systems up front, having the difficult conversations when it's easy, actually looking at like the optipessimism, like what could go wrong if everything goes right. Also, just like I think we both would like from people a little bit more self-aware honesty about things. Like when I've done consulting for organizations that say want to make their spaces more accessible, I always try to say to them, like, one, you can't be welcoming to everyone all the time. There's definitely some people that you're going to not want to welcome into your spaces. And then there are going to be limitations. Like I think about small swing dance organizations. Like it would be amazing if we could make it accessible to people using wheelchairs who cannot stand up, for swing dance to be accessible to them, or someone who's blind. And if you're a little volunteer group of people and like the money that people pay to say come to the dance is what pays to rent the space and bring the DJ or the teacher or whatever, and that's it, it's unlikely you're going to have the resources to make huge systemic changes. But what I would always say in those groups, like, don't actively tell these people they can't come, and like ask them what it is that they need. Like one, like don't don't infantilize them and assume that they have no idea what they need or like no idea what they're doing in the space, because probably they do. But then also just be open to saying like, hey, we don't have like X, Y, and Z resources, but we want to make space for you by at the very least not telling you you have to leave, but also like working with you to figure out what can and can't happen here, rather than just being like, it has to be perfect from the beginning or it's all terrible forever. Like, let's figure it out together. But then if you have a space where you can't be accessible to a certain group of people for whatever reason, just being honest about it. Like, just being like, yep, okay, we would love to be able to provide for X, Y, and Z group of people, and we currently do not have the ability to do that, and we're just going to be honest about it. Um, but I think people are afraid of that kind of thing, because if you're not perfect, you're a bad person, and if you're a bad person, it's all over, right? um, so then, if you're up for it, can we talk just about something a little bit different in general? Just about, have you been watching any of the new Star Treks?
Yes.
I would love to hear your thoughts about them, because I've been watching them. I haven't gotten to see any of Picard, but everything else I've been watching, and I have lots of feelings.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. I'm a fan of Discovery. I'll try to avoid it all as much as I can. All spoilers. Discovery took me a while to warm up. Like you know, I didn't see where it was going the first couple of episodes. Um, and it felt very just sort of orthogonal to everything else that had been done. But then I started to see where it was going.
Mm-hmm.
And then it Discovery became sort of to me anyway, and I know it's very divisive, but for me, it felt like it really leaned into the inclusivity themes
Mm-hmm.
that had been present in previous Star Treks, but maybe not intrinsic. It felt intrinsic there. Um, I think it also deals with some really complex overarching plot lines. Sometimes Discovery feels a little bit like improv long form, but where you get too many offers thrown at once. And it's like, and what about this and this and this and this? You're like, oh, cool, okay, great. You get to resolve all of that in an hour. Good luck. But in general, and I think it's really interesting because it's so different than like a TNG, which was very episodic.
Mm-hmm.
Or just sort of isolated, but the Discovery very arc based, right? Like
Yeah.
very narrative, which can also be difficult for folks to get into. Yeah, it's a shame that they're doing like NFTs and stuff.
Yeah.
That's true. That's a whole other discussion. But moving on to Picard, I enjoyed season 1 of Picard. I thought I was going to enjoy season 2 of Picard. Like the start was fun, and then I was like, what is happening? Why, why, why? And I don't want to like spoil stuff, but it was very cerebral.
Mm.
It felt like we were watching Picard through Cerebro. I'll just say like like Professor X was telling us Picard's story in a way. Like I don't know. It didn't feel as connected to the Star Trek ideals because it is fixated on some TNG plot points, and the way it got fixated was very, again, sort of like it got orthogonal in the way that I feel like the beginning of Discovery was. It's like, but then Strange New World. So you mentioned I did improv Star Trek. So I did that for 9 years in the Seattle area. We called it Where No Man Has Gone Before. And I played a bunch of characters. We played, we had a couple different episode formats. And this will make sense in a second. So we had Planetary Visit. We had Space Sickness. We had alien diplomats. And so I would be like the alien that were chasing around the planet on, it's like the Planetary Visit, and then I was her chapel in Space Sickness, and I was like the helmswoman in the planetary, the diplomat kind of visit one. And the first episode of Strange New Worlds is all story building, right? They're just giving you context, like get everybody on the Enterprise. But after that, I texted our director, I'm like, did they look at our notes? Because I was like, first episode, because we'd have like suggestions we would get from the audience. So like our Planetary Visit one was like, what's a concept, what's a topic you might learn about, and something Spock doesn't understand. And so I texted my director. It was like, first episode, it's linguistics and Schadenfreude.
Yeah.
And then the next one was space sickness. And they had it was the whole thing. And so it feels, as someone who studied TOS, the original series, as part of this troupe, and worked with the director who really studied it to pull out formulaic elements and parody them. It feels extremely connected at a spiritual level to structure. And they do the same thing. We one way we tried to make it more Trekish. She was like, well, hey, one thing in TOS is they use a metaphor and analogy a lot. They're like, they'll say this really complicated space thing, and they'll be like, it's just like blowing up a balloon. And I see that happening a bit. Like they do it felt like they were sitting with us in our rehearsals.
Wow.
In a good way. And so yeah, I think it's fun. I like Strange New Worlds.
Wow. Yeah. I've been very excited by the fact that there's a bunch of Star Trek coming back, because I love Star Wars as well. And I know that people often say you gotta kind of have one or the other. And I've been really excited for all the Star Wars stuff again too. And I'm so glad that Star Trek is also getting a bunch of love. And I don't know if you got to watch the Lower Decks at all.
Oh yeah, we didn't even talk about Lower Decks. It's a totally different perspective on this.
Yes.
Series. We've never looked at it in that frame. And so I love the creativity in the space now. And that it feels like, I like that it feels like there's something for everyone, but the spirit, the aspirational spirit of the show generally remains. It's an important message and model.
Mm-hmm.
So to be able to get it out to more audiences, if you like narrative arcs, this one's for you. If you love episodic stuff, this is for you. If you like snarky Rick and Morty stuff, maybe go over here.
Yeah. Is there any Star Trek series that you just actually don't really like?
There's stuff that I haven't had the time to watch yet that I've deprioritized because of perception, and that of course would be Enterprise. It's funny, there's not stuff that I actively dislike. I think the closest I get is the second half of Picard season 2. I was just what is happening? I started Mystery Science Theatering the thing. Mm-hmm. I love Patrick Stewart, but I was just what is why? But even these TOS, original series for the unconverted, if you just watch those out of context, they are problematic. There is a lot to unpack, right? But because I was in this show, I was conflicted at first. I'm wait a minute, okay, so I'm doing this. Am I setting feminism back years by this? And so I read but I really liked the fact that we were playing with the core aspirational piece of Star Trek, and it was a really fun thing to parody. And I read these are the Voyages, which is a three-book series which chronicles the production of original series, of each episode, and pre-production and post-production of the whole series in context of the original period. Mm-hmm. When the script was written, what was controversial, what was happening in the news, what did the network folks think about it, who was campaigning for stuff, what got cut, what got kept. And in that context, I'm oh my God, this was so cutting edge. There was so much that they did that set so many standards that had never happened before on television. And then of course, that was the first time I realized that Lucille Ball was it got us Star Trek too, and I'm like, I'm 100% on board for all of this. It's there are imperfections around here, but the larger context, they were so ambitious with what they were trying to do with the show, and I love that. And it doesn't come across if you watch it out of context, but I love it for what it was trying to be.
Yeah. Somebody said the stream may have crashed, but my OBS is still in the green, so hopefully it's just this one person. Um, yeah, I absolutely love the original series. I always liked it. I got more into it because the person I was dating in high school's dad was like always high and just always had VHSs of it playing. And like as a kid, before I got ADHD medication, people kind of thought I was high all the time. So I would often hang out with people who were really high, having no idea that they were, and be like, "Yeah, this is great. Like I feel like I'm with my people right now." And like later looking back, I'm like, "Oh, those people were just really high." But anyway, we would just like stand in the kitchen eating like tons of food while like just watching VHSs of the original series. And those are wonderful childhood memories for me. Even though it was like my ex-boyfriend's dad, I was like, this is great. This is just like beautiful. And he has all this commentary and it was amazing. And I also remember learning as a kid, my mom told me this, that Martin Luther King Jr. was a huge fan of the show. And that the actress who played Uhura wanted to quit so she could go be on Broadway, and he begged her not to because of like the importance of her and the representation, and also she's just really cool. And that also like I think is important context because sometimes I think people feel like there's a difference between X thing was always wrong, and even people at the time knew it was wrong, and we can't just say this was a person of their time, for example. Like there's all these like historical figures that people are like, oh, well, they were just a product of their time. And it's like, yeah, actually, if you know more of the context, people in their time period also thought they were like a bit extreme. And then there's things that like are great at letting us see how far we've come because these are things that were pushing the envelope at the time. And I think the original series is an excellent expression of this principle because it's like, yeah, I watch it and I'm like, this is kind of cringy. Or like, yeah, the like, does this set feminism back? And at the same time, it's like, I think it's so wonderful. And I love it as something that shows that it has always been political. It was always intending to be political and to be responding to the things that were happening in the world. And it was intending to be hopeful about the future. And then when people are like, don't put politics into my nerd stuff, it's like, well, I mean, come on, it's always been political. You just didn't notice it when you were a kid.
I mean, like literally every single second.
Yeah.
And it was. I mean, yeah, it's so complicated, the misogyny thing. Like they were putting more women in positions of actual agency than existed at the time. And people forget that the Cage, the original pilot for original series, which is where we got Captain Pike, who's in Strange New Worlds now, the number one role with a woman who's in number two, like in that position, that's what they originally pitched. It's the network that turned that down.
Mm-hmm.
So like this show is trying so hard. And so like it's really cool that like TOS has finally come, or like the series has finally come back to like acknowledging that role. But like they really tried. Now that said, like we did have a warm-up game which we called three-line misogyny because we wanted to poke fun at what and the time period thought was okay. And so like the more like ridiculous we could make it in the show, we wanted to paint it as like, see how absurd this is now. And how much we can laugh at it because it was just never okay. Like this type of opinion of women was never okay. So
right.
That was another one of the tropes we played with because it wasn't like they were trying to do those things a lot of the time.
Right.
But it was a piece of the time. I have a funny story about TOS that I don't know. It may show up in a book somewhere or something. But my singing teacher, she was friends with Harlan Ellison, for like To Be on the Edge of Tomorrow. And she said that he told her about so he was on set sometimes, like talk to folks and stuff. And there was a scene, I think, in that episode where a woman had to kiss Kirk, so had to kiss William Shatner, and he kept flubbing the tape. So this is very relevant because consent, right? Like this is someone abusing a situation a little bit, and maybe a product of time. Like is he really flubbing? Like it doesn't feel like this is accidental. Like it's happened a lot.
Yeah.
And so the director sees that this is happening and is like, you know what, let's break for lunch. Let's just take a breather and come back. And Scarlett Ellison's like, ma'am, can I take you out to lunch? And so he brings the woman out to lunch and gets her like the they order hamburger like covered in onions, just as much like sticky onion as possible at lunch. And they come back and they nail it in one take.
Beautiful. Oh, that's beautiful. I mean, what a story. Oh, what a story. Thank you for telling me that. This is also one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about Star Trek, because I was like, I know you're going to know so much more than I do, and you're going to have amazing things to say. I love that. I'm going to cherish this.
Now, yeah. While William Shatner is a little bit sketchy, I did the times I met the times I met Leonard Nimoy, he was quite the gentleman. He was very, and like that was I you know this, but like I moderated a panel with him at Emerald City Comic Con in 2010, but I shattered my kneecap 2 days prior, and so I was high on Percocet. Right?
Oh wow!
So like, but like not really high because like I was in so much pain, and if you've been through this, you understand. Like I kind of like talk about it as like pain molecules. It's not how it works, right? But like if you have enough pain, there's no Percocet left to make you loopy, mostly because it's just all busy. It's overdoing something. So I was on a lot of Percocet. It was because I had like surgery and they had shoved screws in my knee and limping over there. But he like so this woman like limps over and has got like a Bledsoe brace and crutches, but like he was such a gentleman the whole time. I was so nervous introducing him. It's like, who the hell introduces Leonard Nimoy? Like, what the hell do you do? Like, everybody knows who he is, but I still had to like introduce him. Like as he walks out, he like puts his hand on my shoulder. He's like, great job, and like he's just like he's so nice. But I will say, I didn't get a picture with him in that situation, and because he had to like rush off, and then when I arrived, he was talking to Will Wheaton, who was wearing a Canada hockey jersey because he lost a bet, and so that was all weird. But so I didn't get a picture with him at that con, and so I went to con in Banff and got a picture with him there. And my boyfriend at the time ran the Emerald City Comic Con, so he was friends with all the comic convention folks, and he's like, so Leonard's agent just contacted us. He asked us if we would be willing to transport money across the border for him. Like, I'm sorry, the what?
Oh, wow, okay.
And and he's like, yeah, just like, it's if you can't transport more than 10 grand over the border, so like we, little less than 10 grand cash each. And I'm like, no, I have a giant leg brace and crutches, and the last time we went through security, they like groped me under my brace. I'm like, no, I'm not going to run money across the border. I don't care. Like how cool, like what I don't know if Leonard even knew that this guy was doing this, but like that was a weird thing. That was a weird situation.
That is
like,
weird.
They're weird problems, weird adulting problems to have that you don't expect to have in a moment where you're like, I had to not run money across the border for Leonard Nimoy's agent.
That's fascinating and weird. And also, yeah, security. Nope. Not a good time in general, but also definitely not a good time then. I once had to transport money when I was moving countries, and I had closed a bank account, and very thankfully I had just under 10 grand. But like because I was gonna have to travel through multiple countries, I put all of the cash in my shoe. I had these like big Doc Marten combat boots, and I just like kept it in the envelope in there because I'm like, it's unlikely I'm going to get robbed in this manner. Like someone could steal my bag or whatever, and I'm not going to lose 10 grand. Um, but then the poor person who had to count it, I didn't realize they were going to count it because I'd never had to transport money before, so I had no idea that they were even like that. I didn't even know they were going to ask, and I just had to take it out of my like really sweaty sock and just be like, "Here you are," and it was funny time. Anyway, not very consensual though. um,
Weird adulting problems.
Weird adulting problems. Yeah. One thing also think more people should know about Leonard Nimoy is he was a very amazing photographer.
Yes. And like poetry, like he
Yeah.
had so many things, like that was a lot of what he wanted to talk about in the panel. Like obviously there were questions about Star Trek, but he really wanted to talk about his art.
Yeah. Yeah. And I never got to meet Leonard Nimoy, but he was in my college town for a very small gallery was exhibiting his photography, and I got to go see it, and it was really beautiful. And then I had like a final that was the same day he was going to be there doing like a live
Oh.
event, and I was like, oh, how important is graduating to me?
Oh.
And yeah, graduating was important, so I went to the final. But yeah, I just Star Trek makes me very happy because I feel like it's very, very hopeful, but while not trying to imagine a future where humans are not humans anymore. Like the problems are still very human, and we've learned more tools. There's plenty of good criticisms of Star Trek for sure, and I still really love it. Do you have a favorite series of Star Trek?
Hmm. You know, for a long time, like it still comes back to TOS for me now because of that emotional connection and like improvising for 9 years of watching it over and over again. Um, I, and it's funny too because when I grew up, I grew up on TNG, and for a long time that was the favorite. But then like I also went through this phase where like, oh, Star Trek is for the guys in my family. That kind of I didn't appreciate Star Trek for what like the larger values and large things like that was a discovery in adulthood. It was like, oh wait, they were totally right on this one. This is freaking great. Um, Fun fact, my dad is like super fan. He recorded original series on reel-to-reel tapes. Like
Wow.
he was in it. So like OG fan. But so it was the birthright that I just ignored for a while. But it'll be interesting to see how Discovery shakes out because there's a lot I like about it. It would be hard for it to overcome the stuff that's going around now is very interesting to me. The Stranger Worlds and Discovery are very interesting to me because they are like TOS products of their time, and especially Discovery. And just I want to see how the series bear themselves out. And I'm rewatching Voyager to reform opinions on that as an adult.
Yeah, Voyager. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I decided to subject my partner to actually getting into Star Trek. And I was like, we're going to watch every episode of every Star Trek in chronological order. Um, and so I found like these lists that like put it all, and it was great. And then we got to Voyager, and unfortunately, I ended up just looking up a list of like what are the actually like universe sort of canon important episodes to just watch those because we got like halfway through the first season and I was like, I can't do this. And I'm not sure why. There were a number of things. There was the like, you know, Latino playing a Native American, kind of playing into some stereotypes while also trying to do it justice. There was like Felix and I forget what her name was and their relationship. As a kid, for some reason, that relationship made me really uncomfortable. And then rewatching it as an adult, I was like, yeah, for some reason, this also makes me really uncomfortable. I don't know exactly why, but I feel weird about it. but I wish I could like it because I know so many
Right.
people who do.
The importance of it, and that's yeah, that was just difficult. That's
Yeah.
uh, a challenging one. And I still
Yeah.
need to rewatch DS9 to form adult opinions about it.
DS9 was surprisingly really good because I grew up watching TNG. Like that was, I mean, TNG, I think, started the year I was born and like kind of finished when I was a small child, but that was like the thing that was on reruns
Mm-hmm.
when I was right at the right age for it. And thank you, Jakey, for putting the actual names Neelix, not Felix, and Kess. And that's what I grew up watching with my dad. My dad's a big nerd. I don't know if my dad identifies as a nerd, but he's like definitely a nerd. Like plays video games all the time, has like pretended to be stuck in traffic so that he could go do like Call of Duty 2 tournaments and stuff because he's going to be late to work and like that kind of thing. And he loves Star Wars and Star Trek and like super nerdy guy. And we just watched TNG together. I remember being thinking Deanna Troy was my mom because my mom's name is Deanna and they look slightly similar. And so, like, my parents got divorced at that time, and I didn't have any bad feelings about it. But what I decided to tell other kids was that my mom was on Star Trek, and that's why she wasn't around anymore. um, I don't know if anyone believed me, but I was like, my mom is Deanna Troy. And every once in a while, I like kind of want to write that actress a fan letter and just be like, hey, thanks for like helping childhood me like kind of process my parents' divorce. You're really cool. But then
Very active on Twitter. She might respond to a tweet.
yeah, she is. It's one of those things that's also great because I always worry about like people who are like celebrities that I like or like think are kind of cool or maybe I idolize a little bit and then finding out that they're like terrible piece of shit people. Like
Yeah, yeah.
that's always a fear because it's happened a few times. I'm like, this person's so cool. And I'm like, oh, their actual opinions are no. Um, like J.K. Rowling, just
Yeah, yeah, we all got hit by that one.
yeah.
I mean, I have this hope that like the units stay together, and so it's like it has to be all or nothing. And I find it very hard to believe that actors who succeeded on this show would all be terrible people.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's all conjecture and bias for hoping. Farscape was cool too. Yes, yes, that was a college jam. We had the Jim Henson Company. We had the weird. We had the Will They Won't They. Uh, Ben Browder and Claudia. What's her name? Yeah, that was good stuff too.
Yeah, I really liked Farscape as well. I got into that in college. And there was so much good. I feel like, we talk about a lot of these social issues and the ways in which it's like, everybody, let me back up. A lot of people say why they like sci-fi is because it allows you to talk about present day issues from a different lens. And I've met a lot of people who feel like that's so terribly cliche. And I just feel like it's still true. It's like
No, it is.
it's amazing. And
I things like Shadowrun, where like it was written years ago and kind of like clearly written to try to talk about some of these issues, right? Like race relations and things like that. And you come back to it like what we did when we were doing the show for Hyper RPG in 2016. You're like, why is this all so valid right now again?
right.
But it was not even again. It's just still like the corporate, like capitalism and race relations and discrimination and like identity and stuff. Like, okay, it's all right there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I love Shadowrun. The person who got me into it was someone I dated my freshman year of college. Um, Also, the person who got me into Farscape. They have good taste in things. But how they knew to hook me was just to tell me about like the Native American sort of aspects of it. And I remember at the time being like, wow, this sounds amazing and very like cathartic. And also, I'm not going to think about the stereotypes that a lot of people playing this game might be bringing out, but I mean, it's still pretty cool and cathartic, so this is amazing. Um,
That like baby step thing,
yeah,
that like the problematic representation. You're like, eh,
yeah,
is it good that it's there?
yeah. I've never gotten confirmation of this, and I've just recently started learning German. So if there are any German speakers in the audience, please help me. But I've been interested in the etymology of the Borg. I know it's supposed to be like cyborg, just like shortened, but I feel like technically in German, Borg also means borrow. And I've wondered if there was any like intentionality in there uh, with the idea of like they're like the borrowers. um, but I don't actually know. Do you know anything about the sort of like background on the Borg?
I don't know that specific piece. I feel like that's the kind of thing like if you ask a writer now, they'd be like, yes, that was the plan. I like the story. Uh,
Okay,
but,
Borg is more
but I
like
suspect like my guess, my theory is right now is like, oh, well, the people who coined cyborg used it that way, and they just said Borg. They just took the second half of cyborg.
yeah. I mean, I assume that's what it is. And I think that somebody said Borg, it means more like castle,
Oh,
which also kind of makes
they have
sense.
those big cubes. They build flying fortress things.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and what do you think about the Borg as like a force in? Because
And it's much. And have you watched Picard yet?
no, I haven't gotten to see any of
Okay.
Picard.
Like we could have a totally different conversation after you've watched Picard.
Okay.
Like it's very canony in a peculiar way about the Borg. So there's like pre-Picard and post-Picard Borg. And I think, I think they made a lot of sense in the 80s and they're classic like villain, right? It's always great to have the classic villain. Like, well, they tried to do this with like the Klingons and the Romulans, like they're always going to be evil, and then realize, oops, we baked racial stereotypes into that. What are we going to do? They tried to create a new big bad that was like, well, that's not a race, that's technology. That's always bad. And I think it feels. I think whether they intended it or not, there are some very interesting questions it raises, like Shadowrun, about like sort of almost like capitalism and like colonialism and like and homogenizing people. I think that stuff is, and I think to Krellin's point, you liked the Borg until they changed it entirely. They introduced the Queen. I think Queens break it a little bit. Like, is it a hybrid? Well, I mean, like, yeah, okay, these have queens, but like they do a very specific thing. They don't like control all the things. They just do a specific. They have a specific part they play, just like everybody else in the hive. But the Borg queens are obviously doing a very like they're doing all the things, pull all the strings, blah blah blah. So that in a way made them less scary because you could just target that one point. You can't take down the Borg when they're just like one. You just like you attack this Borg, but then there's this other section of the Borg. Like they're just, it's like COVID. You can't take out COVID, but
Or like the
when you can take
replicants,
out the pardon.
like the replicants from Stargate.
Yeah, exactly. So I think they're a classic villain. They kind of changed over time, and they're always going to be like there's a sinister fear they bring
Mm-hmm.
that is really interesting. But I agree with Krellin's point that something fundamentally changed when around the era the Queen came in, um, and we lost a little something.
Yeah. I remember liking the movie when I was a kid because it was like since the show had kind of ended before I was really old enough to be like watching that kind of show, it was really cool because it was like something new that I could go see in theaters, like with my dad and get really nerdy and excited about. Like it was very, very cool. And I remember feeling like a lot of it went over my head because I was probably like 8. I don't know. I don't remember what year that came out. It was pre 2000 though, right? It was like 98 or something that that movie came out.
Yeah, I don't remember specifically.
Yeah, but anyway, to me the Borg were always really they had this dual purpose, right? They're like the faceless, nameless bad guys that you don't have to feel guilty about killing, right? Like with most other things, there's the idea of like, oh, this person is a person and they have like a life and a family and friends and like this is terrible that they die. But with like the Borg, you could just kind of be like, oh, we have to kill them.
They're zombies, they're already dead, kind of thing.
But I liked in TNG where they subverted that, where they had the one like that was a teenager that they had with them and they like taught him things and then he became like an individual and went back and like changed Borg society. Like I thought that that was really cool that they kind of humanized the Borg in that way. I also always found the Borg terrifying because of like what you brought up earlier, like colonialism and forced assimilation and the like idea of like we're going to take whatever we want from you and your culture and your people and we don't have to ask and we can do with it whatever we want. As you know, there's a lot of like body horror in there too as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
um
And I'm also weirded out by their obsession with Picard.
yeah.
Like, if are you a collective or do you value individualism? Because it really seems like you're a celebrity obsessed culture when you're just like the cutest, OMG, hearts, like what, like that doesn't. It's one thing to be like, oh, that was a big score, but like they seem real obsessed with him in a way that seems counterproductive to the way they've actually been framed.
Right.
Like theoretically, they've already learned everything they need to from him because they had his brain. Like they know all the things. Like,
yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. It's kind of weird the way they're obsessed with him. I feel like they could do a lot more in the show to really expand on that and be like, yes, like we can pull into why are they so obsessed with him? Why was it like a feeling that they got from him being connected to the hive mind or whatever? Like, I don't know. And yeah, I think it could be better. What did you think about different things, just Q in general?
Q. I again, like and you need to watch. You need to watch Picard, and then
Okay.
we'll have another discussion. It doesn't
Yes.
have to be on stream, but like I need you to watch Picard so we can have a talk. But
Wait, can I just ask, is Q part of then Picard? Because I would be excited about that, even if it's bad.
yes,
Okay, good. All right, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Season two. So Q is really interesting. The thing, like the chaotic power that he brings is really interesting from a narrative perspective. But as a viewer, it kind of felt like inside baseball. Like it felt like he would just do something and we didn't know what was like. I get not knowing why, but like there's also like, why am I watching this? Like, why does this matter? Like, why did he throw these people to another place? Like, I wanted to see the space drama. Why has Q messed with that again? There was a little bit of that, and of course, this is the obsession with Picard again. Like, I get it, Patrick Stewart's great, but they didn't often explain why everyone was obsessed with Picard. They just assumed that we understood that, and I feel like, I feel like that was important. And I also just have this very weird association in my head because a dear friend of mine in college had this like super mashup nerd film he had made, and it was a Star Trek movie, but like super fan cam situation, and like from his living room in his backyard. It has the best like trying to do time travel like get out of the past situation I've ever seen, which is like they get stuck in the present and like we have to figure out a way to get back, and so they do this montage where they tried to they watched Back to the Future. They tried to speed the car forward. It didn't work. So the next shot, it's just like they duct taped a Mr. Coffee to the back and tried to speed forward again because they thought that that was like what you know, in
Yeah, yeah,
number
yeah.
two that had like the fusion things that they thought that that would make it time travel. And
Wow.
like, I just thought that visual gag was like one of my favorite things that I've ever seen. It was just so funny. But like there's like this spirit that was summarized for me in a scene where someone's like, well, you know, it must be Q. And he like leaps up, he's like, Q? I hate Q. And he like leaps up on the couch, he's like humping the couch in frustration. I feel like once you get later in the series, you're like, you can't, like as a viewer, I kind of felt that a little bit like, Q? What's he gonna do? Now what? Like now we're just gonna go off on like a tangent, but there's gonna be like a tribunal or something. And like what there's no respect, there's no consent, Q.
There's definitely no consent with Q. Q is, yeah, antithetical to consent, but yeah. I mean, I always have had mixed feelings about Q because it's like the episodes are always weird and like they kind of provoke a particularly difficult feeling of powerlessness and like lack of even like control over what's happening to yourself and like understanding of the world around you. And part of me liked Q because I feel like it was interesting that the ways that they really tried to play with a different species would very likely have a value system that is so different to ours, where there could be it could come to a point where there's no commonality, there's no overlap, there's no like starting point of productive communication. And it also, I like to think about those things in general, even just within history. Like a lot of people now looking back at like Greek stories massively misunderstand them because ancient Greek values and their way of thinking about things like success and failure and like, you know, heroicism and all of this were so different than what we do now that the stories have a completely different feel to them. And it's kind of hard to like get yourself into this mindset of this very different worldview and value system. And so intellectually I really like Q, but like in my actual like feeling experience of the episodes, I'm like, I don't know about this. This is gonna be weird and I'm not gonna be super comfortable.
Yeah.
And
But yeah, it's gonna make you leave a little more squicked than you went in.
yeah, I mean, I feel like it was also just like a fun risk that the writers chose to take, and I appreciate the daring involved with making Q. Like,
And I mean, I can see the kryptonite angle, right? Like you make Picard too capable,
yeah,
and you have to do something to introduce risk again. And like once and I forget whether Q was before or after the Borg kind of encounters with Picard.
Q made them encounter the Borg because he like
Okay,
shifted their ship super far away, and then and then he was like, "See what you're gonna do about that."
So yeah, like so Q is like the narrative kryptonite. They're like, okay, we need to weaken Picard. He's too great. How are we going to do that? And then that's interesting to me too. Like, why couldn't we just encounter the Borg? Had they set him up in another quadrant or something? Is that
Yeah,
it?
yeah,
Okay. So they set this thing up, and then they're like, oh wait, this is a really cool enemy, and they're never going to get there. Now we need an incredible godlike power, and then once you've created the godlike power, can't just leave that out there.
right.
Interesting, very interesting timeline.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I do really recommend though rewatching DS9. I didn't like it as a kid, but as an adult, I have really liked it. I like that it brings more spirituality to the universe. Like this is one of the things that I think Star Wars has a lot of, and Star Trek can feel very like clinical sometimes. And I really like just the ideas of like post-colonial justice and post-colonial like sort of cultural revival, and there's a lot of really interesting like ethical things and things related to consent and sometimes I actually started thinking about doing like writing articles or doing live streams after watching different episodes of DS9 to just be like, I just want to analyze like what happened in this episode because there was so many interesting things going. I mean, this is true with Star Trek in general. Like you could do that after every episode, but and the end of DS9 gets a little off the rails, and you're just like, okay, sure, you can keep going with this. I mean, I thought you would have just wrapped the story like 2 seasons, like this one aspect of the storyline just like kind of keeps going. And it's great. It's great. It's also kind of if you liked uh, Dune, if you've ever read the Dune book and the idea of like prophecy and being seen as like a messiah and the ways in which prophecy can be molded also to fit the person who's being seen as the subject of prophecy. I think DS9 does a really good job, similar to the way Dune did a really good job with that. But as you can tell, I like sci-fi in general. Yeah. Like any sci-fi, I'm usually just like, yeah. Someone earlier wrote in chat that like they can't get enough of sci-fi, they always want more. And I'm like, yeah, same. I just always willing to engage with more of it. I think it was J.M. Plotz. I'm not sure who said it.
Yeah, that's my mom.
Oh, it is. Oh, nice. Yeah. Hi, Cheryl's mom. Oh, nice. So then, yeah, Raised by Wolves. Other people have recommended that to me too. What did you think about the new Star Trek movies? The J.J. Abrams ones.
Well, like they're really good action movies, right? And there's like, do you want to consider them on their own? Do you want to consider them as attempts to retcon timelines, or do you want to consider them as attempts to represent the entire timeline of, or like the entire set of Star Trek values? I feel like those are three different discussions. Mm-hmm. Like the timelines are messy. Like it's a weird thing to do. It like I kind of appreciate that they chose a path to acknowledge. I guess I appreciate that they chose to acknowledge that both worlds can exist, so that we don't have the endless nerd debate of which world is better. Like,
yeah.
Or at least the stakes are lowered on that. Like, you know, saying like, oh, the first one, like we're just saying they're all there, multiverses, whatever. But it's complicated. Then there's the whole like, it doesn't feel like, if you're going to say which does TOS in the movies represent the values more, it feels like TOS weirdly to me was more plugged into the values of the series. Like, but Star Trek, the original, was like a really good movie, and Chris Pine is great, and I actually really love his Kirk. I like their Spock Kirk dynamic. Like I thought that was all really good, like really into the movie. But it's just like, if you look at it in the larger spectrum of things, like it's a good movie, but is it like a good Star Trek movie?
Yeah,
that's open for debate. And then like the one with Benedict Cumberbatch, I'm like, that's just an action movie. Like that, you can just like, it's not Star Trek. That's, I don't know what that is, but it's not Star Trek.
Yeah, yeah. I really liked the first movie. I think the casting was really good. Like they just did a really good job. Everybody felt good to me. Mm-hmm. The Benedict Cumberbatch one, it was a fine action movie.
Yeah.
And I do think Benedict Cumberbatch is a very good actor. And
he was directed in an action movie and did fine in that. It just,
yeah. I also just felt like they really changed the feeling of Khan from the original Wrath of Khan. And like it was okay. He was like, I don't know, turbo white supremacist in the new one. And it's like, okay, yeah. And I feel like there was elements of like intensity to the original Khan that were really lost.
Yeah, there's like the intellectual banter, the like, it felt like he could disassemble Kirk's mind.
Yeah.
In a weird way. Like he would be able to counter anything that Kirk did. And like, I wonder if it would have had more impact if it was just a different bad with perspective, as opposed to like trying to replace Khan. So instead of hearing the message, which is an important message, like don't be a white supremacist, but if you're all you're going to hear is this guy's different, not as good as Ricardo Montalban, then the message is not going to land.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just one of the things that's also tough when you want to have a bad guy who's supposed to be like so much better than everybody and like so much smarter. Don't let them monologue. That always ruins it because the monologues that like are just written by random people and they're never going to be like
True.
it's not going to be like some new like completely mind-blowing philosophical treatise. Like no, it's just going to be similar things all over again about like might equals right or whatever. It's or like a really bad rereading of Nietzsche. And it's like, cool. I mean, like, I've heard this thing a bajillion times. Simultaneously, I just had this talk with Charlie after watching the latest season of Stranger Things. And I'm no spoilers for that, but there is a monologue in it. And I had so many mixed feelings about the monologue because I'm like the kind of person who would do these sorts of things thinking it's coming from a place of superiority probably would have these really stupid ideas and would monologue in these ways and it's always disappointing and it also feels really like accurate. um do you watch Stranger Things?
We're in the middle of it. We're like, we just finished episode 6. I mean, what we can't get over is that that's a series of movies. Like every episode is
Yes.
between like an hour 20 and an hour 40. What happens to television?
Yeah.
That's such a life commitment.
Yeah.
Like I often find it hard to watch one movie a night or like a couple new movies a week, and they're just like, "Hey, we're going to need you to commit in a timely manner to a series of 9 movies." Like we would spread out like the north of the like Star Wars. The 3 trilogies took like decades, and here they're just dropping like not 3 trilogies of movies in like
Yep.
2 months.
Yeah.
Like when did that become what we do? It's a lot. It is a lot. And I don't know like if it needs to be or if like, writers are just like, I'm not gonna edit myself anymore because like I don't know. I get paid by the word. But it's like it's interesting, but does it need to be that long? I don't know that it does. That's a lot of time commitment.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, for me, I'm the kind of person who, with Stranger Things in particular, I like it so much that I'm like, yeah, thank you for making the episodes ridiculously long. I want more. Give me more. And one of the things Stranger Things does for me a lot is just the nostalgia, and the fact that it's like referencing in really great form so many just like classic films that really have shaped pop culture. And I think it does them in a very excellent way. And it's very cool. I'm glad that sci-fi and fantasy is actually becoming more mainstream. I know a lot of nerds are just like, no, it's don't we were bullied for this and you can't like it now. And it's like I get that a little bit. Like, yes, I was definitely of the age where when I was a kid, there was bullying for being into these things. And overall, I think it's good that it's getting more popular. Anyway.
I mean, because especially the ones that have aspirational messages.
Yeah.
That we need that out there.
For
we
sure.
Need that to Trojan horse good things to people who catch them by surprise and be like, wait, what?
Mm-hmm.
People matter? Oh.
Yes, I totally agree with you. Yeah. Well, it's been surprisingly already 3 hours. It went by very, very, very fast. Um, and I had a liter and a half of water over the course of these 3 hours. So I need to pee.
That's fair. Yes.
But thank you just really so much for coming and hanging out with me on stream. It's really always a joy to talk with you and to talk shop and then also to talk nerd things and everything in between. And yeah, it's just been a real joy.
Yeah, it was super fun to talk to you. Thanks for the questions on so many different topics. We got nerd. rarely get to nerd out on Star Trek these days, so that was especially fun.
Oh man, anytime. Anytime you want to nerd out on Star Trek, yes, please. Just let me know because we can talk about it. I would also definitely be down to do like a Star Trek role-playing game stream at some point if you're ever doing that. Because I'm really into it. Someone did just mention if you haven't seen Severance in chat, I definitely want to say you should. Severance is like
agreed. Recommended.
yeah, that show also really kind of hit me intense. It's like really intense. But yeah, thank you again. And for everybody who joined, who's normally here with Cheryl, thanks so much for coming and being in my audience tonight. I do stream also on Tuesdays where I play Stardew Valley and I talk about community consent and autonomy and like life stuff and nerdy things. So you can always join me there. And I will.
And you can find me on Funny Godmother on Twitch. It's at the same time as this stream, so that may not be where you're catching me. But also Funny Godmother on Twitter, and I'm the Cheryl Platz on TikTok for a variety of reasons I could go into on a different stream. But it used to be Funny Godmother, but they can't do that anymore.
Mm-hmm. So. And I want to give one last shout out to your book, Design Beyond Devices. It's behind you, yeah, right there. Definitely check it out, even if you're not in design exactly. It's got a lot of really interesting and relevant questions to ask yourself and to think about things. So give it a check out. All right. Well, thank you all again, and talk to you all later. Bye.